Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. The call came in just after sunset. A couple of campers deep in the forest near Wolf Hollow were missing. I'd heard about Wolf Hollow for years, a remote, seldom visited area, cut off from most of the hiking trails. Locals whispered about it, said it had a strange vibe, a bad energy. Superstitions mostly. I've always thought it was just an overgrown patch of woods, but the stories. They were hard to ignore after so many years of hearing them. I was the senior park ranger on duty that night, so I didn't have much choice. The couple had been out there for 3 days without checking in. My job was to track them down, make sure they were all right, and bring them back. Simple enough. Or so I thought. I grabbed my gear, radioed the station, and set off down the trail. It would take about 2 hours to reach Wolf Hollow from the station, and by the time I got there, the last sliver of daylight would be gone. The forest was already swallowing what was left of the evening light, the trees casting long, gnarled shadows across the ground. I wasn't easily spooked, but something about the quiet of the woods that night felt wrong. Even the wind, which usually stirred the leaves and brought a sense of life to the forest, had died down. The air was still, thick. The path to Wolf Hollow was barely a path at all, overgrown with ferns and thick roots that reached across the trail like bony fingers. As I hiked deeper, the trees grew closer together, their branches tangling overhead, blocking out the moon. My flashlight became my only lifeline, its narrow beam slicing through the darkness. I kept moving, forcing myself to ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at my insides. After about an hour, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, distant owls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, were gone. Completely. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and suffocating, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Then in the distance I heard something, a faint voice. It was too far to make out the words, but it sounded like someone calling for help. My pulse quickened. It had to be one of the campers. I picked up my pace, moving through the thick brush toward the sound. As I got closer, the voice became clearer, more distinct. It was a woman, her tone desperate and trembling. "Help me, please, someone," I called back. "I'm coming. Where are you?" But as soon as my voice cut through the silence, the forest seemed to swallow the sound. No response. The voice had stopped as suddenly as it had started. I slowed down, scanning the woods with my flashlight, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The trees, thick and ancient, felt like they were closing in, like the forest itself was alive, aware of my presence. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement just at the edge of my flashlight's beam. Something large, slipping between the trees. At first I thought it was an animal, a bear maybe. But bears don't move like that. It was too quick, too fluid, its shape too distorted. I couldn't get a good look, just a glimpse of something tall, hunched, with long limbs that seemed to glide through the shadows. I called out again, but this time my voice faltered. "Hello? Anyone out there?" Silence. Then the voice came again, closer this time, but it didn't sound right. "Help me, please, I'm lost." The same words, but wrong somehow, like they were being mimicked. My blood ran cold as I realized the voice was now coming from the direction I had just come from. It couldn't have been a camper. I hadn't passed anyone on the trail. I hadn't seen any signs of people out here at all. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight back down the path. The beam cut through the fog that had started to roll in, casting strange shadows against the trees. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. A shape, just barely visible in the mist. It stood on the path, about 50 feet away, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its body distorted in ways that made my stomach churn. It looked almost human, but wrong, stretched, twisted, and it was looking at me. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I knew it was watching. I knew it was aware of me. I gripped the handle of the knife on my belt, my heart racing. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, as the thing began to move toward me, slow and deliberate. "Help me," it said again, but this time it wasn't just the voice of the woman I'd heard earlier. It was my voice, perfectly mimicking me. Something primal took over, and I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran, but it felt like hours. The trees blurred around me, the ground uneven beneath my feet, but I didn't care. I just had to get out, had to get away from whatever that thing was. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The sound of footsteps followed me, heavy, thudding, unnatural. They were faster than they should have been, closer than they should have been. I stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for breath, my legs burning. The footsteps had stopped, but the woods were still watching. I could feel it. That thing was out there, just beyond the circle of trees, waiting. Suddenly my radio crackled to life. "Ranger, do you copy? We've got a report of some strange activity out your way. What's your status?" I grabbed the radio, desperate for a lifeline. I'm here, but there's something in the woods. Something. It's not right. It's not human." Static hissed in response, and then a voice came through. My voice. "We're fine. Everything's fine out here." I stared at the radio in horror. I hadn't said that. The voice continued calmly, in my own tone. "Heading back to the station now." And then silence. I slowly lowered the radio, every inch of me trembling. The footsteps started again, closer this time, circling the clearing. And then from the trees I heard it. "Help me, please." My own voice. I backed away, heart hammering, as the figure emerged from the darkness, tall and twisted, its eyes hollow, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. I don't remember how I made it back to the station that night. The next thing I recall is bursting through the doors, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. My coworkers looked at me, concerned, asking what happened, where I had been. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. The next day, a search team was sent out to find the missing campers. They didn't find them. But they did find the tent, ripped to shreds, surrounded by claw marks in the earth. And deep in the woods, near the site where the tent had been, they found something else. Footprints. Mine. Leading into the forest. I haven't gone back to Wolf Hollow since, but every now and then when I'm out on a routine patrol, I hear it. My voice calling to me from the trees. "Help me, please." I'll never forget that night deep in the woods, how the darkness felt thick, suffocating, almost alive, the kind of black that presses in from all sides, swallowing your thoughts until the only sound is the rhythm of your own breathing. I wasn't even supposed to be out there. It was a spur-of-the-moment trip, a last-ditch effort to clear my head after months of work and stress had weighed me down. Just me, my backpack, and the wide, open forest of Black Ridge. The hike had been exhausting, and by the time I found a decent clearing to set up camp, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. The ranger at the station, an older guy with a weathered face, had warned me to stick to the trails. His eyes were too serious for my liking, but I shrugged it off. I just needed one night away from it all. A fire, some stars, and silence. Silence. That was the first thing that started to bother me after I settled in. The usual forest sounds were absent. No rustling leaves, no insects buzzing, not even the distant call of an owl. Just stillness. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the crackling fire, the warmth against my face. But the quiet was unnerving, creeping into my bones. It wasn't until much later that I realized what should have tipped me off from the start. When the woods are quiet, it's because something out there has silenced them. I was dozing off when I heard it, something moving just beyond the glow of my fire. I sat up, straining my ears. A twig snapped, and then there was this soft, dragging sound. It stopped as soon as I stood up. I called out, my voice too loud in the unnatural silence. "Hello, who's there?" Nothing, just more quiet. My heart started hammering in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam over the edge of the clearing, half expecting to catch the reflective eyes of some nocturnal creature. But the light revealed nothing. Only trees, their twisted limbs casting shadows like long skeletal fingers. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A low guttural growl. I froze. Whatever it was big. Bigger than a deer. The growl deepened, vibrating through the ground beneath my boots. I backed toward the fire, my eyes darting between the shadows, but still. Nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I heard a voice. Faint, almost familiar, but warped. It called my name. John. I whipped around, shining the light toward the sound, but I saw nothing. No one. The voice came again, closer now, but wrong. Too stretched, like a recording played at half speed. "Johnny, come here." Panic started bubbling up. I hadn't told anyone I was coming here. No one should know my name. And that's when I saw him, the park ranger. His figure materialized from the shadows, standing just beyond the light. Relief washed over me for a second. I almost laughed. It was just him, the guy from the station. He must have been out on patrol. But then he stepped forward and I saw his eyes. They were black, like oil slicks void of anything human. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he didn't quite know how to use his limbs. My stomach turned. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice cracking. He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, and that's when I noticed something horrifying. His skin wasn't right. It hung loosely like it didn't belong to him, stretched and sagging, as if it had been draped over his bones. "John," he whispered, his voice rasping, dragging out the syllables. "Come. With me." I stumbled back, heart racing, nearly tripping over my tent. This wasn't the ranger. This thing, whatever it was wearing him, like a grotesque costume. I bolted for the trees, leaving my gear and the fire behind, not daring to look back. Branches tore at my arms and face as I ran, blind and frantic, crashing through the underbrush. My lungs burned with every breath, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I could hear it. No, them. Following, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. And then I heard it again. Another voice, different this time. "John, over here." I skidded to a halt, almost collapsing from the sudden stop. Ahead of me stood another ranger, his flashlight flickering in the dark. This one looked real, his face lined with genuine concern. "Thank God," I gasped, staggering toward him. "There's something in the woods. It's—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice steady, but grave. "We need to move, now." Without waiting for my response, he grabbed my arm and pulled me along the trail. His pace was relentless, and I struggled to keep up. The sound of footsteps and rustling followed us, too close for comfort. Whatever it was, it hadn't given up the chase. As we rounded a bend in the trail, the ranger turned, his face illuminated by the moonlight. My heart dropped. His skin, it was too smooth, too perfect. And his eyes, black. Before I could scream, I felt cold fingers close around my neck from behind, yanking me back into the shadows. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the two rangers standing together, their faces splitting into identical, twisted smiles. Then silence. I woke up in the morning, sprawled on the ground next to the cold ashes of my fire. My gear was untouched, my body unharmed, but the forest, it was still, deathly still. I scrambled to my feet and ran all the way back to the ranger station. The older ranger was there, the real one, looking at me with concern as I burst through the door, out of breath and shaking. "You made it back," he said, his voice heavy with something like resignation. "What the hell was that out there?" I demanded, still shaking. I saw— I warned you to stay on the trails, he interrupted softly, avoiding my eyes. But once they've seen you, there's no going back. I never went camping again after that night. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear my name whispered on the wind. I should have listened to my gut. The second we parked the car at the trailhead, something felt wrong, but it was late, and the rest of the group, Mia, Sam, and Jason, were all buzzing with excitement for the trip. We'd been planning this weekend for months, a 2-night camping trip deep in the untouched woods of Blackwater Forest. No cell service, no people, just pure isolation. Perfect, right? We should have turned back. By the time we set up camp, the sun was dipping below the tree line, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The air was cool, but something about it felt thick, almost like it was suffocating, hanging around us like the woods themselves were waiting for something. The first night was calm for the most part. We laughed around the campfire, told ghost stories, the usual. But when the fire started dying down, the woods around us grew unnervingly silent. Not just the normal quiet of a remote forest, but a complete and unnatural stillness. No insects buzzing, no leaves rustling. Just nothing. I don't like this, Mia had whispered, staring into the trees. It's too quiet. Jason, always the skeptic, chuckled and tossed another log onto the fire. Come on, it's just nature. No wolves or bears out here. Relax. But I couldn't shake it. My senses were on edge, like every part of me was tuned in to something that wasn't there, or at least something I couldn't see. Sometime in the middle of the night I woke up. I don't know what stirred me, maybe a noise, maybe the cold. But when I opened my eyes, I felt that thick, oppressive feeling again. My tent was zipped shut, but I could feel it. Something was out there, just beyond the nylon wall, watching. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. It wasn't an animal, at least not any I recognized. The steps were too measured, too heavy. I held my breath, every instinct in me screaming to stay silent. The sound circled the tent, moving closer, and then stopped right outside. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen, but eventually the footsteps retreated, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I told the others about the footsteps. Sam, always the logical one, tried to explain it away as an animal. Maybe it was a deer or a boar, he said, shrugging. But Mia's eyes met mine, and I could tell she didn't buy it. She had heard it too. We both had. That day we hiked deeper into the woods, following an old trail that barely seemed to exist anymore. It felt like we were walking into another world, the trees growing denser, the light filtering through the canopy in thin, sickly beams. As we walked, I noticed something strange. There were markings on the trees. Not carvings or scratches, but symbols. Odd, jagged shapes that made my skin crawl just looking at them. When I pointed them out to the others, Sam shrugged again, dismissing it as old Native American stuff. But I knew better. These weren't relics of the past. They were recent, fresh. By the time we reached a clearing, the sun was starting to dip again, and the air felt even heavier than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just watched, followed. I kept glancing back, expecting to see something between the trees. A shadow, a figure. But there was nothing, only that suffocating stillness. We set up camp in the clearing, and that's when things really started to go wrong. It was Mia who saw it first. She had wandered off to collect firewood and came running back, pale and breathless. "There's something in the woods," she gasped, pointing frantically behind her. It looked like a person, but it wasn't." "What do you mean, wasn't?" Jason asked, laughing nervously. "You probably just saw a deer or something." Mia shook her head violently. No, it stood up. It was on all fours, but it stood up like a man. But its legs, they were all wrong. Backward like—" She stopped, shuddering, unable to finish. We laughed it off at first, thinking she was spooked, but as night fell, the mood shifted. The quiet returned, deeper this time, more oppressive. We all felt it. And then the noises started. At first it was a distant rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, just like the night before. But this time, they weren't circling the tents. They were coming toward us, and we huddled around the fire, our flashlights scanning the tree line. And then we saw it. A figure, just barely visible between the trees, crouched low to the ground. It moved with an unnatural grace, too fast, too fluid. And then, just as Mia had said, it stood up. Its legs bent wrong, like a human body forced into an animal's form. The head was elongated like a snout, but the eyes, God, the eyes, they were human, too human. Sam swore under his breath, stumbling backward. "What the hell is that?" We backed away slowly, but the thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, its eyes glinting in the firelight. Then, without warning, it dropped back onto all fours and slunk into the shadows, vanishing into the forest. We didn't sleep that night. No one spoke. We just sat there waiting, listening to the sounds of the forest that never came. By morning, we were ready to leave, but as we packed up camp, we noticed something that made my blood run cold. Around our camp, in the dirt, were footprints. Huge, clawed prints, far too large to belong to any animal. They were everywhere, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. The hike back was hell. Every step felt like we were being watched, like that thing was just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mia kept muttering under her breath, eyes darting around like she was trying to see it before it saw her. We reached the car just before dusk, but as we loaded our gear into the trunk, I saw something that made me stop cold. On the edge of the parking lot just beyond the trees was the figure again. It stood there watching us, motionless. Then slowly it raised a hand, no, not a hand, but a twisted claw, and pointed directly at me. We sped out of there as fast as we could, but even now, back in the safety of my apartment, I can still feel it watching. I see it sometimes in the corners of my vision, just beyond the edge of the light. Waiting, because it knows where I am. It was supposed to be an easy weekend. Just me, my brother Daniel, and our friend Kyle, camping out in the dense backwoods of Cedar Hollow. The three of us had grown up hiking together, exploring the outdoors, so we figured we'd get one more trip in before the summer ended. Cedar Hollow was perfect, remote, thick with trees, and far from any city noise. We'd found an old, forgotten trail on an old map, and thought it would be fun to follow it as deep as we could go. No phones, no GPS, just the three of us, a compass and enough supplies to last the weekend. We wanted to challenge ourselves, push a little deeper into nature than we ever had before. We should have turned back when we saw the ranger. We had parked at the ranger station to check in, and the guy behind the desk looked at us like we'd just stepped out of a grave. His uniform was worn, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Exhaustion? "Cedar Hollow?" he asked, frowning as he looked at our gear. "That's a rough area. Not many folks head out that far anymore. You sure about that?" "Yeah," Daniel said with his usual confidence, slinging his pack over his shoulder. "We've camped all over these woods. We can handle it." The ranger stared at us for a long moment before nodding slowly. "If you say so, just don't go too deep. People go missing up there. Strange things happen. You hear anything at night that doesn't feel right. Just stay in your tent. Don't go looking." Kyle laughed, thinking the guy was just trying to spook us, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. Still, we were excited, so we shrugged it off and headed out. The first day was perfect. We hiked deeper and deeper into the woods, far beyond the well-traveled paths, the canopy growing thicker above us. By late afternoon, we'd found a small clearing next to a creek and set up camp. The air was fresh, the trees towering over us like ancient guardians. It felt like we were the only people for miles. But as night fell, something shifted. It was subtle at first. The usual sounds of the forest began to fade, leaving an eerie stillness. No birds, no rustling leaves, no wind. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something is watching, listening. We sat around the fire trying to brush it off, telling stories, laughing. But we were all on edge. Even Kyle, who usually wasn't afraid of anything, kept glancing over his shoulder into the darkness. Every now and then we'd hear a faint noise, like footsteps, but too slow, too deliberate. Around midnight, as the fire burned low, Daniel stood up, his face pale. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. We all stopped talking and listened. At first there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire. But then, faint and distant, we heard it. A voice. It was soft, almost like someone was speaking from far away, just on the edge of hearing. It didn't sound right, though. Too hollow, too broken. Like someone was trying to mimic a human voice but didn't quite know how. "Who the hell is out here?" Kyle muttered, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. We all listened again, but the voice had stopped, just silence. "I'm gonna check it out," Kyle said, already heading toward the trees. "Probably just some other hikers messing with us." I grabbed his arm. "Kyle, wait. What if it's not hikers? It could be an animal or something else." He shook me off. "Come on, man, don't tell me you're scared. It's probably nothing." Against my better judgment, Daniel and I followed him. We grabbed our flashlights and knives, making our way toward the tree line. The beams of our lights cut through the darkness, but all we could see were shadows and the faint glow of the fire behind us. And then we heard it again, closer this time. A voice, clearer now, but still wrong, like it was calling out, but the words were garbled, almost inhuman. The sound chilled me to the bone. Kyle stopped in his tracks. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. We stood there for a long moment, listening. The voice was all around us now, like it was circling, but we couldn't see anything. Just the dark woods pressing in on us. "Kyle," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to go back. Now." But before he could respond, there was a loud snap, like a tree branch breaking, followed by the sound of something moving through the brush. Fast. Too fast. It was coming toward us. We bolted. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. We tore through the trees, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted back toward camp. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I could hear something behind us, something big, crashing through the underbrush, following us. When we finally burst into the clearing, the fire had almost died. We grabbed what we could, our bags, our tent still half collapsed, and we ran. We didn't stop until we reached the trail, and even then we kept moving, practically running all the way back to the car. When we reached the parking lot, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the ranger station. The ranger was standing outside, waiting. He didn't say anything when he saw us, just nodded slowly like he knew. We threw our gear into the car and sped off, none of us speaking, all of us shaken to the core. I haven't spoken much to Daniel or Kyle about that night. None of us want to acknowledge what we heard, what we felt. But I know one thing for sure. We weren't alone out there. And whatever was in those woods, and it wasn't human, I still hear it sometimes, though, late at night when everything is quiet. That voice, whispering just on the edge of hearing. "I'll never go back to Cedar Hollow, and if you're smart, you won't either." I've been a park ranger for 7 years now. Most of that time I've been stationed at Eagle Peak National Forest, a vast, sprawling wilderness deep in the heart of the Rockies. It's a place that feels untouched by time. The forest is so thick and overgrown in some areas that sunlight barely filters through, even on the brightest of days. Towering pines stretch endlessly, their trunks twisted and gnarled, and at night the wind whispers through the branches like it's carrying secrets from an older world. But not everything out here feels natural. The story I'm about to tell you isn't one I share often. Most people wouldn't believe it. And even now, I sometimes wish I could convince myself that it wasn't real, but I know better. It was real. Too real. It was early October, and the season was winding down. Most tourists and hikers had packed up, leaving the park quiet. A few stragglers remained, the ones who liked to brave the late autumn chill, but for the most part it was just me in the woods. I was on the night shift, patrolling the less traveled trails, making sure no one got lost or stuck in the cold. We'd had reports of strange animal sightings. A few hikers claimed they'd heard something big moving through the underbrush, and a couple even said they'd seen glowing eyes in the distance. Nothing too out of the ordinary for this area. Bears, wolves, mountain lions, plenty of animals here can spook the unprepared. But that night, things felt different from the start. I was about halfway through my patrol walking the North Ridge Trail when I noticed the woods had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt path and the occasional creak of a tree swaying in the wind. It wasn't uncommon for the forest to go silent at night, but this was different, like the entire world had been muted. I stopped for a moment, listening. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling, like something moving slowly through the brush off to my left. I shined my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but the beam barely penetrated the thick undergrowth. I figured it was probably a deer or a raccoon, so I kept walking. The rustling followed me. Every few steps I'd hear it again, just far enough away to make me question if I was imagining it. But it was there. Something moving parallel to me, keeping pace. I stopped again, my heart rate picking up slightly. I called out, half expecting to see the reflective eyes of a deer staring back at me. But there was nothing. Just the still dark woods. I kept walking, but faster this time. The trail started to narrow as I moved deeper into the forest, the trees pressing in on either side, branches reaching overhead like bony fingers. The rustling grew louder, closer. My hand instinctively went to the radio clipped to my belt, but I hesitated. What was I going to say? That I was being followed by something? I'd sound paranoid, or worse, like one of those conspiracy theorists who talk about cryptids and creatures lurking in the woods. I pushed the thought aside and pressed on, my pace quickening. The rustling was keeping perfect pace with me now, and I could hear twigs snapping underfoot, something heavy moving through the brush. And then, ahead of me, I saw a flicker of movement. My heart skipped a beat. I flicked the flashlight forward, and for just a second I caught sight of something tall, dark, and hunched over. Whatever it was disappeared into the trees before I could get a good look, but the glimpse I got made my skin crawl. It was fast, too fast for any animal I knew of. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath fogging in the cold air, and that's when I realized something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The forest was still silent, but this time I wasn't the only one standing still. The rustling had stopped. Whatever had been following me had stopped too, and it was close, very close. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when I saw them, eyes. 2 large, glowing eyes, reflecting back at me from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to a wolf or a bear, and the way they moved, it wasn't right. They blinked slowly, deliberately, and then they rose higher, as if whatever creature they belonged to was standing up on 2 legs. My mouth went dry. It stepped out from the trees just at the edge of the light, a hulking figure with long, gangly limbs and a head that was too large, too wolf-like. But it wasn't a wolf. No, this thing was something else entirely. Its body was covered in coarse matted fur, and its arms, they were too long, almost dragging the ground. But the eyes were the worst part. They weren't animal eyes. They were too intelligent, too calculating, like they were studying me, deciding what to do next. I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking. "This is Ranger Owens," I stammered into the mic. I need backup on the North Ridge Trail. There's something out here. I don't know what it is." Static crackled in response, but no one answered. I backed away slowly, my flashlight still trained on the creature. But it didn't move. It just watched me, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly, as if it knew I was scared, as if it enjoyed it. Then, without warning, it let out a low, guttural growl, and the sound was so deep, so unnatural, that it felt like it shook the ground beneath me. My legs almost gave out, but I forced myself to move, turning and sprinting back down the trail. Behind me I heard the sound of heavy footsteps, fast, impossibly fast, closing the distance between us. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just following me anymore. It was hunting me. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, the trees blurring past me, branches slapping at my face and arms. The sound of its pursuit grew louder, closer. I could hear its breathing now, ragged and hungry, like it was right behind me. I burst into the clearing where my truck was parked, fumbling for the keys in my pocket. The footsteps were almost on top of me now. I could feel it, its presence, the heat of its breath. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, just as something heavy crashed into the side of the truck, rocking it violently. I didn't dare look. I jammed the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Without looking back, I floored the gas, peeling out of the clearing and down the narrow dirt road, the truck fishtailing on the loose gravel. Only when I was miles away, with the dense forest behind me, did I allow myself to breathe. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel, my heart racing. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen or heard of before. Later, when I finally got back to the ranger station and radioed for help, no one believed me. They said it was probably just a bear, maybe a wolf, and I'd let my imagination get the best of me. But I know what I saw. I know what was out there. A few weeks later, a group of campers went missing on the North Ridge Trail. No trace of them was ever found. Just their tents, torn apart, and their gear scattered in the woods. Sometimes late at night, when the wind is just right, I think I hear that growl again, deep and haunting, carried on the wind. And I know it's still out there. The hike into the backcountry was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a break from the relentless grind of city life. I needed to get away, to clear my head, so I packed my gear and headed out to one of the most isolated parts of the national park, miles from the nearest trailhead where you could walk all day and never see another person. It was perfect. The first day went smoothly. The trail was quiet, only the occasional bird call or distant rustle of animals in the brush. I set up camp just before sunset, in a small clearing nestled among towering pines. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped fast. The fire I built crackled and popped, filling the air with the comforting smell of wood smoke. For a while I just sat there, staring into the flames, letting my mind wander. The forest at night is a strange place, though. As darkness swallowed the landscape, the silence grew deeper, too deep. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the faint sound of the wind stirring the branches overhead. I tried not to think too much of it. Wilderness could be eerie, especially if you weren't used to it. I figured the animals had quieted down because they sensed a predator in the area, maybe a mountain lion or a bear. But still, the quiet pressed down on me in a way that was hard to ignore. That's when I heard the first noise. It started as a low, almost imperceptible hum, like distant machinery, growing louder and sharper by the second. I turned, scanning the darkened tree line, expecting to see headlights or a plane passing overhead. But there was nothing. And then, as quickly as it had come, the noise stopped. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks. I tossed another log onto the fire and took a deep breath, watching the embers glow as the flames caught. I was alone. No one else was out here, I reminded myself. No one but me. But later that night, as I lay in my tent trying to sleep, I felt it again. That prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I rolled over, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around me, listening. The fire outside was dying, the faint crackle of embers barely audible through the thin tent walls. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, too quiet. And then there was the sound of footsteps. Not the padded steps of an animal, but the deliberate, slow crunch of something, or someone, moving through the underbrush. My pulse quickened. I held my breath, straining to listen, hoping it was just a deer passing through. But the footsteps didn't sound like a deer. They sounded too heavy, too deliberate. I sat up in the tent, my breath coming shallow, eyes wide as I peered out through the small mesh window. The clearing was empty. The fire was just a smoldering pile of ash now, casting faint, flickering shadows. I could see the dark silhouettes of the trees surrounding me, standing like silent sentinels, but no people, no animals. I waited, heart thudding in my chest, listening as the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. I must have imagined it. Maybe it was just the sound of my own movements rustling the fabric of the tent. That's when I heard the whisper. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but as I listened closer, I could make it out. A voice, low and raspy, barely more than a breath. Come out. Every muscle in my body froze. My heart pounded in my ears, and for a moment, I thought I'd misheard. But then it came again, louder this time. Come out. Into the woods. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced through every horror story, every urban legend I'd ever heard about people disappearing in the woods. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to stay put, to lock myself in the tent and wait for morning. But something primal, something deeper, wanted me to run. The voice came again, closer now. Come into the woods. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, my hands shaking. I had to know what was out there. My fingers fumbled with the zipper of the tent, and as quietly as I could, I pulled it open just enough to shine the light outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty, just the dark shapes of trees and the faint glow of the dying fire. No people, no animals, no tracks in the dirt. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see someone lurking there, watching me. But there was nothing. The voice was gone. The footsteps were gone. But that feeling, that crawling, insidious sensation of being watched, lingered. I zipped the tent back up and lay there, wide awake, staring at the roof of the tent, my heart still racing. Sleep wasn't going to come easily that night. Hours passed. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to the sound of something scraping against the tent. I bolted upright, my hand gripping the flashlight again. My breath came in shallow gasps as the scratching continued, circling the tent slowly, methodically. Whatever was out there, it was close. So close I could hear it breathing, slow and steady. Scratch, scratch. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the flashlight on and unzipped the tent in one swift motion, shining the beam into the darkness. Again, nothing. The clearing was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But then, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It was tall, too tall to be human, its limbs impossibly long and thin. It stood there completely still, its head cocked to one side, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. I stumbled backward, falling out of the tent, scrambling to get away. But the figure didn't move. It just watched, unblinking, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. I fumbled for my backpack, grabbing the first thing I could find, my hatchet, and held it out in front of me, heart pounding in my throat. But still, the thing didn't move. And then it spoke. In that same raspy, whispering voice, "Come into the woods." I didn't think, I just ran. I don't remember much of the sprint through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots tangling at my feet, but I ran until my legs gave out, until the darkness of the trees swallowed me whole. Somehow I made it to a dirt road. A park ranger found me there the next morning, half delirious with exhaustion, clutching the hatchet like a lifeline. I tried to explain what had happened, about the voice, about the figure in the woods, but the ranger just shook his head. "You're not the first," he said quietly, eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. and you won't be the last. They're always watching out there. I never went back to those woods, but sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment at night, I still hear that whisper. Come into the woods. There's something about the deep woods that feels alive, like it's watching you, waiting for you to make a wrong move. I've been a park ranger for years, stationed at a remote outpost in the Pacific Northwest, and I've seen things that don't make sense. At first, I thought the stories were just myths, local legends to keep campers from wandering too far off the beaten path. But that was before last fall, before I saw it. We had a group of hikers go missing near Timber Ridge, a dense, almost claustrophobic stretch of forest that hadn't been properly mapped in years. I got the call early in the morning. 3 experienced hikers, gone without a trace. Their friends reported them missing after they didn't return to camp. Search and rescue had combed the area, but the thick fog rolling in from the mountains made visibility nearly impossible. That's when I was called in to take over. The woods were unusually quiet that day. Normally you'd hear the rustle of small animals, the distant chirping of birds. But not this time. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I strapped on my pack, grabbed my rifle, standard issue for predator encounters, and headed into the trees. Timber Ridge is old-growth forest. The trees are massive, towering giants that block out the sky. Moss drapes from the branches like veils, and the ground is a thick carpet of ferns and rotting leaves. It's easy to get turned around if you don't know where you're going, even with a compass. But I'd been through these woods 100 times. I knew them. Or at least, I thought I did. I started my search at the trailhead where the hikers were last seen. Their footprints were easy enough to follow at first. 3 sets, side by side, heading deeper into the woods. The trail was clear, like they were on a mission, confident. But about a mile in, things got strange. The footprints stopped, abruptly, like they'd just vanished. No signs of a struggle, no animal tracks, nothing. I crouched down, inspecting the ground. The leaves were undisturbed, not even a sign of them turning back. It was as if they had been plucked out of existence. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like something sour, rotting, but it grew stronger the deeper I went. It wasn't the smell of a decaying animal. It was different, thick, cloying, like spoiled meat mixed with damp earth. I pressed on, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest felt wrong, like it was closing in around me. The fog had rolled in thick now, swirling between the trees like a living thing, hiding everything beyond a few feet in front of me. The trees themselves seemed to bend, their branches twisting in unnatural angles. I told myself it was just the fog playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl so deep I felt it more than heard it. I froze, gripping my rifle tighter. The sound wasn't far. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I was a ranger, and those hikers were still out there. I had to keep going. I moved forward cautiously, every step slow and deliberate. The growling had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. I rounded a bend in the trail and came across something that made my blood run cold. There, scattered in the dirt, were their packs, torn apart, shredded like paper. But no bodies, no blood, just the remnants of their gear, abandoned like they'd dropped everything and run for their lives. My radio crackled to life at that moment, startling me. I fumbled for it, bringing it to my lips. "This is Ranger Tate. I've found their gear, but there's no sign of the hikers. Repeat, no sign of the hikers." The radio crackled back with static, but no voice. I tried again, but nothing. The fog must have been messing with the signal. I kneeled down, sifting through the wreckage. A few water bottles, a torn sleeping bag, one of their hiking boots, shredded. But as I reached for what looked like a flashlight, I heard the sound again, closer this time, the growl, but it wasn't alone. There was another sound beneath it. Whispering. Faint, like voices carried on the wind. I stood up, slowly turning, my heart in my throat. At first I saw nothing, just the endless stretch of trees, the fog twisting between them. But then I caught movement, a shadow. No, several shadows, dark shapes, just on the edge of the fog, too far to make out clearly, but close enough to see they weren't human. They were tall, unnaturally tall, hunched over, with limbs that were too long, moving in jerky, unnatural motions. And they were watching me. I raised my rifle, instinct taking over. "Who's there?" My voice sounded too loud in the oppressive silence. No answer, just the whispering, louder now, like it was coming from all around me. The figures didn't move, they just stood there shifting slightly in the fog, their eyes reflecting the faint light in the most unnatural way. Glowing, almost. I backed up slowly, keeping the rifle trained on them. I needed to get out. I needed to leave now. Suddenly, one of the figures moved. Fast. Too fast. It darted between the trees, coming closer, and for the first time, I saw it clearly, or at least as clearly as the fog would allow. It was like something out of a nightmare, a twisted, distorted version of a human, but wrong. Its face. God, its face. It was long, stretched, with eyes too large for its head, glowing in eerie yellow. Its mouth hung open, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. But what struck me most was the stench that hit me like a wall as it approached. That same rotting, sour smell, but stronger, overwhelming. I didn't think. I fired. The gunshot echoed through the woods, impossibly loud, and the figure recoiled, disappearing into the fog. But the others, they didn't run. They moved forward, slowly, deliberately, as if they weren't afraid, as if they were testing me. The whispering grew louder, the words almost intelligible now, but I couldn't understand them. It wasn't English, wasn't any language I knew. It was ancient, guttural, wrong. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran or how I managed to find my way back. The trees seemed to twist and shift as I moved, like they were trying to trap me, confuse me. The whispering followed me the whole way, and every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw those figures, just out of reach, always watching. By the time I made it back to the ranger station, I was shaking. I slammed the door behind me, bolting it shut, my mind racing. I tried the radio again, but it was dead. No signal, just static. I was alone. For the rest of the night, I sat in the corner of the station, rifle in hand, watching the windows. I never saw them again, but I could feel them. Out there, waiting. The hikers were never found. Officially, they're listed as missing, presumed dead, likely a bear attack or some other predator. But I know the truth. I know what's out there, lurking in the fog. I don't patrol Timber Ridge anymore. No one does. But every now and then, late at night, I hear the whispers again, carried on the wind just outside the station, and I know they're still watching. I've always been drawn to the quiet places, the ones most people avoid. Maybe it's the introvert in me, but there's something about the deep wilderness that calls to me. So when my buddy Drew suggested a weekend camping trip in a remote section of a national park that's rarely visited, I was all in. We'd heard rumors about the place, of course, strange stories, disappearances, old legends about creatures lurking in the woods. Drew loved that kind of stuff. He always had a fascination with cryptids, with the unexplained. Me? I figured most of it was just campfire stories. Nothing more than local folklore. The drive was long, taking us deep into the heart of the park. There were no marked trails where we were going. The plan was simple: hike out to the lake, set up camp, fish, and enjoy the isolation. It sounded perfect. As we unloaded our gear and began the trek, I could already feel the change in atmosphere. The trees were dense, their trunks thick and gnarled, and the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. The air felt heavier, cooler, like the woods were holding their breath. There was something still about it, unnaturally still. We hiked for hours. eventually finding a clearing near the lake. The water was like glass, untouched and serene. It was the kind of place where you'd expect peace, where nothing could possibly go wrong. We set up camp, got a fire going, and kicked back. Drew was in high spirits, excited to be off the grid, far from cell service and civilization. As night fell, we sat by the fire sharing stories. Drew, naturally, began talking about the legends of the area. "You ever hear of the Mimic Man?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. I shook my head, leaning back in my chair. "Nope. Is this another one of your cryptid tales?" He grinned. "Sort of. The story goes that there's this thing out here. People have been seeing it for years. They say it can imitate sounds, voices, even people. But it's not just mimicking. It learns. It gets closer to perfect every time." I rolled my eyes, laughing. "Sure. Let me guess, it's also 10 feet tall and eats campers for breakfast?" Drew's grin faded, and he looked into the fire. "No, it's not like that. It doesn't attack. At least, not at first. It just wants to get inside your head. It wants you to let it in." I chuckled, but something about the way he said it made me uneasy. Drew had a way of spinning these tales, but this time his tone was different. Like he believed it. "All right, enough with the spooky stories," I said, standing up to stretch. "I'm going to grab some more wood." I headed into the trees, flashlight in hand. The air was crisp, the night quiet. Too quiet. Even the usual rustling of leaves or calls of nocturnal animals were absent. It felt like the entire forest was waiting. As I bent down to gather some branches, I heard something, faint but unmistakable. A voice. It was low, a whisper carried on the wind. "Hey, need help with that?" I froze. It was Drew's voice, but it was wrong. Too distant, too hollow. I swung the flashlight around, but there was no one there. I could see the glow of the campfire through the trees, and I knew Drew hadn't moved. "Drew?" I called out, but there was no response, just that unsettling quiet. I hurried back to the camp, my heart racing a little faster than I'd like to admit. Drew was exactly where I left him, sitting by the fire, looking up at me with a puzzled expression. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Did you follow me into the woods?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He frowned. "No, man, I've been right here. Why?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but something about the woods felt off. I brushed it aside, trying to enjoy the rest of the evening. We sat around the fire, talking and laughing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Later that night, after we'd both crawled into our tents, I lay there listening. The forest was still too quiet. It was as if everything, every living thing, was gone. Then I heard it again. Drew's voice. This time, it was right outside my tent. "Hey, can you hear that?" his voice asked almost playfully. I sat up, my skin crawling. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died down to embers, and Drew's tent was zipped shut across the campsite. He wasn't outside. "Drew?" I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. There was no response, just that heavy, suffocating silence. I crawled out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and moved toward Drew's tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I unzipped it slightly, peeking inside. He was there, fast asleep, breathing deeply. The voice I'd heard, it wasn't him. I backed away, scanning the tree line with my flashlight, every shadow seeming to shift and move. My breath caught in my throat when I saw something. There, standing just at the edge of the trees, was a figure. At first I thought it was Drew, but as the light hit it I realized it was wrong. Its posture was awkward, its limbs too long, its head tilted in an unnatural angle. But the worst part? Its face. It was Drew's face. No, not quite. It was a close imitation, almost human, but the eyes were too large. The mouth stretched too wide in an eerie, grotesque grin. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. The thing took a step forward, moving awkwardly, as if learning how to walk. It reached a hand out toward me, its voice, Drew's voice, crackling in the night. "Need help? With that?" The voice was a mockery, a hollow attempt at mimicking speech. My body went cold with fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, Drew's real voice snapped me out of it. "Hey, what are you doing?" He was behind me, standing at the entrance of his tent, rubbing his eyes. He hadn't seen the figure yet. I swung my flashlight back toward the tree line, but the figure was gone. Nothing but empty woods where it had been standing. "I heard something," I stammered. "It sounded like you, but it wasn't you." Drew's face went pale. He looked at me, then back at the trees, the reality of what I was saying sinking in. He didn't question it. He didn't laugh it off. Instead, he quickly started packing his gear. "We need to go now," he said, his voice low, urgent. We packed up faster than I thought possible, neither of us saying a word. The weight of the situation pressed down on us, heavy and undeniable. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that thing, that imitation of Drew, and standing there watching us. As we started hiking back to the car in the dark, Drew broke the silence. "The legends, they say it watches from the woods, it learns, and once it learns enough, it replaces you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was racing, replaying that horrible, twisted version of Drew's face in the darkness. We made it back to the car just as dawn was breaking. The sun felt like a blessing, chasing away the shadows that had haunted us all night. We didn't speak the whole drive home. We didn't need to. We both knew what we had seen, even if we couldn't explain it. But the worst part? The thing that keeps me awake at night, sometimes when I'm home lying in bed, I hear it again, that voice, Drew's voice. "Hey, need help with that?" I've been camping alone since I was a kid, always drawn to the stillness of nature. There's something about the quiet, the isolation, that clears my mind. At least that's what I used to think. Last fall, I decided to head out for a long weekend deep in the Blackwater National Forest, far from the marked trails. I'd always enjoyed pushing myself to camp in remote places where it felt like no one had been in years. This spot was special, a hidden clearing by a small forgotten lake, miles from the nearest ranger station. I had found it on an old faded map years ago, but had never ventured there until now. When I arrived, the air was crisp, the sky bruised with the fading light of dusk. Tall pines encircled the clearing, their jagged branches clawing at the orange sky. It was beautiful, but there was something about the place that felt wrong. I tried to shake off the feeling as I pitched my tent, setting it up close to the water's edge. The lake was still, unnaturally so, like glass reflecting the darkening sky. There wasn't a single ripple on the surface, no sign of life at all. It was as if the entire forest had been frozen in time. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed the eeriness was just the remoteness of the place. I was alone, after all. What could be out here to disturb me? As the sun dipped below the trees and the last traces of light vanished, the silence became heavier. No birds, no insects, just nothing. I'd camped in quiet places before, but this was different. It felt like the forest was listening to me, like it was waiting for something. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that I was just on edge from the long hike. After a quick dinner by the fire, I crawled into my tent, hoping a good night's sleep would shake off the weird vibe. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the crackle of the dying fire. A rustling like dry leaves being dragged across the ground. It came from the direction of the trees, just beyond the clearing. I sat up, listening carefully. The rustling grew louder, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, poking my head out. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing, just the trees looming tall and still, casting long shadows over the campsite. The sound stopped. I scanned the tree line, feeling my pulse quicken. "Hello?" I called out, my voice unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. No answer, no movement, just the stillness of the forest. For a moment I considered the possibility of an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but that didn't explain why the noise had stopped so suddenly. I stood there for a while, my breath fogging in the cool night air, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I retreated back into the tent, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching from the shadows. Hours passed. I drifted in and out of sleep, my senses on edge. Every rustle of fabric, every creak of a tree branch jolted me awake. It was well past midnight when I heard the whisper. It was soft at first, barely perceptible, like the wind blowing through the trees, but it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, and it was coming from just outside the tent. "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought maybe I was dreaming, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. A woman's voice pleading, "Please, help me." I sat up slowly, reaching for my flashlight with trembling hands. The voice was coming from the lake, just beyond the flap of the tent. "Please, I'm lost." I hesitated. No one was supposed to be out here. I hadn't seen another person for miles, but that voice, it sounded so desperate, so broken. Against my better judgment, I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold night. The moon had risen, casting an eerie silver glow over the clearing. The lake's surface gleamed, untouched by any ripple or disturbance. I scanned the shoreline with my flashlight, the beam bouncing off the trees and the still water. No one. The voice came again, closer this time. "Help me. I don't know where I am." It felt like it was right behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, the flashlight shaking in my hand. But there was nothing. No one. Just the trees, silent and unmoving. That's when I noticed the tracks. They weren't human, not exactly. The prints were large, like a man's bare feet, but the toes were too long, too spread apart. I knelt down, my breath catching in my throat. The tracks led from the lake and stopped right at the entrance to my tent. I stood up, every instinct screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But before I could move, I heard a noise, a wet shuffling sound, like something dragging itself across the ground. I swung the flashlight toward the lake, and that's when I saw it. A figure was emerging from the water, its body pale and bloated, the skin stretched tight over its bones. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it wasn't used to walking. Water dripped from its matted hair, and its head lolled to the side at an unnatural angle. My legs locked in place as the thing slowly dragged itself onto the shore. Its black, empty eyes fixed on me, and its mouth, twisted into a grotesque grin, opened wide. "Help me," it croaked, but the voice was wrong now. It was hollow, like it was being pulled from somewhere deep and far away. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as I scrambled toward the tent. But before I could move, I saw more of them, figures emerging from the trees, the lake crawling out from the darkness. Their pale skin gleamed under the moonlight, their eyes empty pits. Some of them had faces twisted into silent screams, others grinning, but all of them were moving toward me, slow and deliberate. I ran, I don't know how far or how long, but I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing somewhere deep in the forest, far from the lake. I didn't stop until the sun was high in the sky. I never went back for my gear. I left everything behind, my tent, my pack, all of it. I just kept walking until I found the ranger station again. When I told the rangers what happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a younger guy, pulled me aside as I was about to leave. "You camped by the hollow lake, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, confused, and his face paled. "That place, it's not on any of the official maps. We don't talk about it because—" He trailed off, looking over his shoulder as if someone might be listening. "People see things there, things that aren't supposed to exist." I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. But as I left the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me, waiting for the next poor soul to stumble upon their hollow domain. The silence of the wilderness used to be my escape. Now it haunts me. The fire crackled softly in front of me, sending sparks up into the cool night air. The towering pines around the clearing loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a break from the chaos of city life. Just me, the trees, and the stars. But something felt wrong. It started earlier that afternoon. I'd been hiking for most of the day, making my way deeper into the heart of Blackwood Forest. It wasn't a well-traveled area, which is exactly what I wanted. I'd heard stories about people getting lost here, about strange occurrences, but I chalked it up to local legends meant to scare tourists. After all, forests are full of noises. Creatures scurry through the underbrush, branches snap, the wind howls through the trees. It's easy to let your imagination run wild. But this was different. I first noticed the silence. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. It wasn't just the absence of birds or animals. It was like the forest itself had stopped breathing. The usual sounds of nature, the wind, the leaves, the occasional rustle, were gone. It felt unnatural, and with it came a sensation I couldn't quite place, a feeling like I was being watched, not by an animal, but by something intelligent, something that understood I was there, alone. By the time I found a clearing to set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The sky had taken on that eerie twilight glow, where the light is just enough to see, but the shadows seemed darker, more oppressive. As I started building my fire, that sense of unease deepened. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was psyching myself out. But then I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, something moved. It was quick, almost too fast for me to register, but I caught a glimpse. A shape, human-like, but not quite right. It disappeared as quickly as it had come, slipping behind the trees before I could focus on it. I froze, staring at the spot where it had vanished, my heart thudding in my chest. Was it just a trick of the light? Maybe an animal? A deer? Or a bear? But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen wasn't either of those things. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my hands were shaking as I finished setting up camp. The fire eventually took hold, the flames casting flickering light against the darkening woods. I felt a little better with it burning in front of me, but that nagging sense of being watched never left. As the night wore on, the feeling only grew stronger. It was around midnight when the first sound came, a low, distant call, like something was trying to speak through the trees. At first I thought it was the wind, but it didn't ebb and flow like a breeze. It was too deliberate, too steady. I sat up, staring into the darkness, straining my ears to hear. There it was again, soft, guttural, like a voice carried on the wind. It sounded almost human, but wrong, distorted. "Hello?" I called out, more out of reflex than anything else. My voice sounded small, fragile against the vast, looming forest. The noise stopped, and for a moment I thought I might have scared it off. But then a new sound reached my ears. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. They crunched through the underbrush, circling the edge of my camp just beyond the light of the fire. I grabbed my flashlight, heart racing, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit the area, but the sensation of being watched intensified. I scanned the perimeter, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Who's there?" I shouted. No answer, just the sound of the fire crackling and my own ragged breathing. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the trail back to my car was long, and hiking in the dark didn't seem like a smart move, especially with whatever was out there. I decided to stay by the fire, hoping that whatever it was would lose interest. But the forest wasn't done with me yet. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something, or someone, moving just outside my tent. It was a soft shuffling, like bare feet against leaves. My heart leapt into my throat. I reached for the flashlight, but as I flicked it on, The sound stopped again. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make any noise. When I poked my head out, the fire had nearly burned down to embers. The forest was still, but the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. I shined the flashlight around the campsite, its beam cutting through the shadows. And then I saw it. Standing just beyond the tree line, maybe 30 feet away, was a figure. It looked human, but its posture was all wrong, too tall, too thin. Its limbs elongated in a way that made my skin crawl. Its face. God, its face was pale and expressionless, like a mask. I froze, unable to breathe, unable to move. The figure stood there, perfectly still, watching me. It didn't blink, didn't move, just stared with those empty, hollow eyes. I felt my blood turn to ice. For what felt like hours, we stayed like that, locked in a silent, terrifying standoff. Then, without warning, it stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I couldn't. I sat by the fire, keeping it alive, my back to the tent, staring into the trees. Every rustle, every snap of a twig set my heart racing. But I didn't see it again. By the time dawn broke, I was already packing up. I wasn't going to stay another minute in that place. As I slung my pack over my shoulders and started down the trail, I glanced back at the clearing one last time. That's when I saw the tracks. Bare, human-like footprints leading from the edge of the tree line directly to where my tent had been. But the thing that chilled me to the bone, the tracks didn't lead away, they just stopped, as if whatever had been watching me had vanished into thin air. I hiked out of that forest as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the parking lot. When I got there, the same ranger I'd spoken to when I arrived was waiting by the trailhead. "Didn't expect you back so soon," he said with a curious look. "Something scare you off?" I didn't say anything, just shook my head and kept walking. But as I reached my car, he called out again. "Be careful out there next time," he said, his voice oddly flat. "The woods, they don't like to be disturbed." When I turned back to look at him, he was gone. No sign of him, no vehicle, nothing. I've heard stories since then about Blackwood Forest, about strange figures, about people who go missing and are never found. I've never been back, and I never will. I've always loved the isolation of the wilderness. No distractions, no noise, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackling of the campfire. But I'll never go back after what happened last fall. It started as a simple trip, a weekend alone, camping in Cedar Hollow, a forest so remote you have to hike several miles from the nearest trailhead just to get to the heart of it. Perfect, I thought. No cell service, no people, just me and nature. I'd been to Cedar Hollow before, but this time I was pushing further, deeper into the forest. I wanted real solitude, to feel the weight of the wilderness pressing in on me. When I arrived at the trailhead that afternoon, the parking lot was empty, not a single other car. Good, I thought, I was truly alone. The hike in was uneventful at first, just the usual sights and sounds of the forest. But as the sun started to set, the atmosphere shifted. The woods got darker faster than I expected. And the silence, there's something about it that feels different when you're that deep in. Not peaceful, not serene, just still. Too still. I set up camp beside a small clearing, the trees around me towering like ancient guardians. I had enough daylight left to gather firewood, and soon enough I had a small fire going. As the flames crackled and danced, I settled into my chair and tried to relax, but something was bothering me. That eerie stillness. No birds, no rustling in the bushes. Even the wind seemed to have died. An hour later, I was still feeling uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I kept glancing into the trees, thinking I saw movement just beyond the firelight, shadows darting between the trunks. But every time I looked closer, there was nothing. That's when I heard the first sound. It was distant, faint, almost like a scream, but too far off to be sure. I brushed it off. Probably an animal. Mountain lions, maybe. They make weird sounds sometimes, right? I tried to ignore it, but the uneasy feeling grew. There was something out there. I could feel it. My fire felt too small, like it couldn't hold back the darkness that was pressing in. I kept scanning the trees, waiting for some shape to emerge. Then the snap of a branch. Close. I shot up from my chair, gripping my flashlight. I pointed it toward the noise, but the beam barely cut through the thick night. Just trees, more shadows. I listened intently, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. They were slow, almost as if something, or someone, was trying to sneak up on me. But they were unmistakable. The crunch of leaves, the snapping of twigs. They circled the camp just outside the reach of the firelight, never coming into view. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence. I took a deep breath and tried to steady my nerves. Maybe it was just an animal. But the pattern of those steps. No animal walks like that. Too deliberate. Too measured. And then the smell hit me. A rancid, overpowering stench, like something rotting. It drifted in with the wind, and I gagged, covering my mouth. The fire popped and hissed, struggling to stay lit as the air grew colder, unnaturally cold. I backed toward the fire, shining my flashlight into the trees. The footsteps had stopped, but the stench remained, thick and cloying. And then I saw it, just at the edge of my light, a figure standing between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs were all wrong, too long, too thin, like it had been stretched. Its skin, if you could call it that, was pale, almost translucent, clinging to bones that jutted out in sharp angles. Its face, God, I still can't describe it fully. It was like it had a face, but it didn't at the same time. A featureless, gaping expanse. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the fire, but when I looked again, it was gone. I stood there, heart racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But before I could even process it, I heard another noise, this time from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. There, at the edge of the clearing, was another figure. This one was crouched low on all fours, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I couldn't move. I was trapped, surrounded. Then, out of nowhere, a man stepped into the clearing. He wore a park ranger uniform, his face shadowed by his hat. Relief flooded through me for a split second. But as he got closer, I realized something was wrong. His movements were too stiff, too mechanical, like he wasn't fully in control of his own body. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "There's something out there," I stammered, pointing to where the creatures had been. He didn't even glance that way. Instead, he just stared at me, unblinking. "It's too late." "What? What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the forest around us exploded with sound. Footsteps, hundreds of them, all rushing toward us from every direction. I turned to run, but the ranger grabbed my arm with an iron grip. "You can't leave," he hissed, his voice distorting, deepening into something that didn't sound human. I yanked my arm free and ran into the trees, heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, I could hear the ranger's voice, but it wasn't just his voice anymore. It was layered, like multiple people speaking through him, all saying the same thing over and over. "You can't leave." I ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the direction, just desperate to get away. But no matter how far I went, I could hear them, the footsteps, the whispers, the heavy breathing closing in around me. Eventually, I burst out of the trees and onto a dirt road. My car was parked just ahead, right where I'd left it. I sprinted to it, fumbling for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I slammed it shut and locked it, gasping for breath. For a moment, everything was silent, no footsteps, no whispers. But then, from the edge of the woods, I saw the ranger again. He stood there just watching, his face twisted into that same unsettling grin. I floored the gas pedal and didn't look back until I was miles away, the trees shrinking in the rearview mirror. When I finally got home, I tried to report what happened, but Cedar Hollow, they told me, had been closed for months. No park rangers, no visitors. It was off limits after a series of strange disappearances. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what was stalking me or what that ranger really was. But I can still smell that stench sometimes in my nightmares, and I can still hear those footsteps getting closer. And I know one thing for certain, whatever's out there in Cedar Hollow, it's waiting. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to believe in the things that go bump in the night. You know, the kinds of stories people tell around a campfire just to freak you out. But after what I experienced last fall in the backwoods of Colorado, I'm not so sure anymore. In fact, I don't think I'll ever sleep easily again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just me, my buddy Marcus, and his younger brother Danny. We'd packed light, drove far, and trekked deep into the isolated woods of a national forest. You see, we weren't interested in crowded campgrounds with RVs and screaming kids. We wanted something wild, something untouched. And we got it. The first day was normal, even peaceful. We set up camp near a creek and spent the afternoon fishing. The only sounds were the wind threading through the trees and the soft trickle of water. But as evening crept in, that peaceful silence became something else. It was like the forest was holding its breath. There were no birds, no insects, nothing. We should have taken that as a sign. We lit a fire just as the last sliver of daylight disappeared. Marcus joked about the lack of wildlife, calling it prime Bigfoot territory. Danny, of course, laughed it off, and I chuckled too, but something about that joke made my skin crawl. I didn't say anything, though. We were miles from anyone, maybe miles from anything, and that isolation was starting to feel a little too real. That's when the first howl pierced through the trees. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was high-pitched, like a scream, but guttural, as if something massive was forcing it out of its throat. We all froze, eyes wide, listening. It came again, closer this time, echoing through the trees. Marcus laughed nervously. Must be a coyote. But there was no confidence in his voice. Coyotes don't sound like that. Another howl, this one even closer. The fire flickered, and I swear for a second, the shadows it cast seemed to stretch unnaturally far into the woods, twisting and writhing like living things. We should get inside the tent, Danny suggested, his voice tight. Marcus shook his head, trying to maintain the bravado, but I could see it in his eyes. He was scared too. We packed up the food and doused the fire, the darkness rushing in around us like ink. I've never felt anything as oppressive as that night. As we zipped up the tent, another sound came, a rustling in the underbrush not 20 feet away. It was a rhythmic sound, heavy, like something large moving deliberately through the forest. We held our breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, like it knew we were listening. Then, silence. I mouthed to Marcus, "What was that?" But he only shook his head. That's when the scratching began. Something was dragging its claws across the tent fabric, light at first, then harder, like it was testing the strength of the material. Danny whimpered, and Marcus shot him a look, telling him to be quiet. But honestly, I didn't blame the kid. I felt like screaming too. Then came the voice. It was faint but clear, my own name. Jake. It sounded off, though, like someone who'd never spoken before was trying to say it for the first time. It echoed around us, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear anything else, but then it came again. Ack! It wasn't Marcus, and it definitely wasn't Danny. Both of them were staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. My mouth went dry and my mind raced. How could someone know my name? We were miles from civilization, and no one knew where we were. That's when the tent started to collapse. Something or someone was pushing down on it from all sides. I could hear the fabric stretching, the poles bending. Marcus fumbled with his flashlight, but the beam flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to warp in the light. There was movement outside, faster now, circling us, accompanied by a low growl that seemed to vibrate the very ground. The tent collapsed entirely, and in a blind panic we scrambled out, hearts hammering. I'll never forget the sight that greeted us outside. The moon was high, but the light was faint, barely illuminating the clearing, and there, standing at the edge of the trees, were figures, not people, not animals, shadows, twisted and elongated, their shapes bending unnaturally in the moonlight. They had the vague outline of humans, but their limbs were wrong, too long, too thin. Their faces, or what I could make out of them, were hollow, empty, just dark voids where eyes should have been. And they were watching us. Marcus whispered under his breath, "What the hell are those things?" But none of us moved. We couldn't. The air felt thick, like moving through syrup. One of the figures stepped forward, and as it did, the trees seemed to bend away from it like they were recoiling. Its head tilted, and I heard it again. The voice, this time louder, more distorted. "Jake." It came from its mouth, if you could call it that. And then, like a nightmare turned real, the thing mimicked Danny's voice. "Danny." We bolted. We didn't think, didn't grab our things. We just ran, crashing through the woods, branches whipping at our faces. Behind us, I could hear them following. No footsteps, just the crackling of leaves and the whisper of voices, all saying our names over and over. We ran for what felt like hours, but the voices never faded. They stayed right on our heels, never closer, never farther. When we finally reached the car, I didn't even remember unlocking it. We just jumped in and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. It wasn't until we hit the highway that the voices stopped. No one spoke for the entire drive back to town. It was like if we talked about it, we'd make it real again. Here's the thing. When we went back a week later with the park rangers, they found our campsite, but they didn't find our tent. They didn't find our bags or the fire pit or anything. What they did find was footprints, massive, human-like, but distorted. They circled the area in impossible patterns, overlapping as if whatever made them had no regard for physical space. And the trees. The bark was shredded like something had clawed at them with unnatural force. That was the last time I set foot in the woods, and now, every night, just before I fall asleep, I swear I hear it again. That voice, calling my name. Jake. And I don't know how much longer I can ignore it. Camping has always been our thing, me, Jake, Sarah, and Chris. We've been doing it for years, ever since college. No phones, no distractions, just the four of us and the wilderness. But this trip was different. We'd heard about a place deep in the mountains, far off the usual trails, a spot that barely anyone knew about. Jake had found it through some forum, a hidden gem for serious campers. The name of the place was Raven's Hollow. None of us had ever heard of it, but that's what made it so exciting. Something new, something untouched. It took us hours to drive there, the roads winding and narrow, cutting through dense forests that seemed to go on forever. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. The air felt cooler up there still, like the forest was holding its breath. We grabbed our gear and set off, following a barely visible trail through the underbrush. There were no signs, no markers, just a path worn by a few brave souls who had come before us. As the light faded, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew taller, their branches thicker, blocking out the sky. After a few hours of hiking, we finally reached the campsite. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, a perfect circle of space that looked almost too perfect. Like something had cut it out of the forest. I shrugged off the feeling, figuring it was just the isolation getting to me. We set up our tents, built a fire, and settled in for the night. The usual banter filled the air, jokes, stories from the old days, plans for the next day's hike. But as the fire crackled and the night grew darker, something shifted. The woods around us were silent, too silent, and no crickets, no wind, no rustling of leaves, just nothing. We all felt it, but no one wanted to say anything. We just sat there staring into the fire, trying to ignore the oppressive quiet. Then, somewhere in the distance, a sound broke the silence. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire, a low, mournful wail that carried through the trees. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Probably an animal," Jake said, though his voice wavered. "A wolf or something." But we all knew it wasn't a wolf. There was something wrong with that sound, something unnatural. It didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard before. The firelight flickered as the wind picked up, and the wail came again, closer this time. I exchanged a glance with Chris, who was sitting across the fire, his face pale in the dim light. "Maybe we should check it out," he said, standing up and grabbing a flashlight. "Are you serious?" Sarah asked. "What if it's dangerous?" Chris shrugged, but there was a nervous edge to it. "We're in the middle of nowhere. It's probably nothing. Could be a hiker lost out here." Against our better judgment, we all grabbed our lights and followed Chris into the trees. The forest felt different now, darker, thicker, like it was closing in on us with every step. The wail echoed through the trees again, so close it made my heart race. We moved slowly, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness, but the beams felt weak, swallowed up by the night. Then suddenly we saw it. A figure stood just beyond the reach of our lights, motionless, tall, thin, and wrong. The proportions were off, limbs too long, head slightly tilted as it watched us from the shadows. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, stepping back. I could barely breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked human, but there was something about it, something twisted. "Hello?" Chris called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, it didn't move, it just stood there watching. "I don't think that's a person," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. And then, without warning, the figure jerked forward, moving in a way that no human should move. Its body bent at unnatural angles, limbs snapping and twisting as it rushed toward us. We ran. I don't remember the sprint back to camp, I just remember the sheer panic, the feeling of something chasing us, breathing down our necks as we tore through the trees. We burst into the clearing, breathless, and collapsed by the fire. But when I looked around, I realized something was wrong. The fire. It was dying, flickering weakly, like it hadn't been tended to in hours. And our tents. They were gone. Completely gone. No trace of them. No gear. No bags. Nothing. "What the hell?" Jake gasped, spinning around in confusion. "We were just here," Sarah cried. "We didn't go that far." It didn't make sense. We'd only been gone for a few minutes, but it looked like we hadn't been here at all. Like the camp had been abandoned for days. And then the wailing started again. But this time, it was all around us, surrounding us. I shone my flashlight into the trees, and there they were, figures, dozens of them, tall, thin, twisted. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on us, feel the hunger in their gaze. We backed toward the center of the clearing, our lights flickering as the figures slowly closed in, their movements jerky, unnatural. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. One of the figures stepped into the firelight, and I recognized it. It was Chris, or at least, it looked like him. But his eyes were wrong, his face twisted into a grotesque smile that stretched too wide. He stepped closer, his body bending and snapping in ways that no human should be able to move. "Chris," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But it wasn't Chris, not anymore. The wail came again, louder, closer, and I knew. Whatever these things were, they weren't human, and whatever had taken Chris, it wanted the rest of us too. I don't know how we got out of there. I don't remember running. I don't remember finding the trail. All I remember is waking up in the car, Jake driving like a madman down the mountain road, Sarah sobbing quietly in the back seat. We never talked about what happened. We didn't tell anyone. How could we? Who would believe us? But sometimes late at night I hear it again, that low, mournful wail, and I know it's still out there, waiting. I've worked as a park ranger for the last 12 years, mostly in small remote areas where tourists rarely venture. But recently, I got transferred to Red Creek National Park, a place with an unsettling reputation. People talk about the area like it's cursed. Whispered stories of strange disappearances, eerie sounds at night, and sightings of things that don't belong in any normal forest. It didn't bother me at first. I'm a rational guy. I don't buy into ghost stories, and I've been in the woods long enough to know that people's imaginations run wild when they're alone out here. But I wasn't prepared for what I'd experienced during my first week at Red Creek. The park is thick with towering pines, their branches intertwining overhead like a living roof that blocks out the sky. It's beautiful, but there's something claustrophobic about it. The silence is almost oppressive. No birds, no animals, just the sound of your own breathing and the occasional crackle of leaves underfoot. It's the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're intruding on something ancient. On my third night, I was assigned to patrol the northern perimeter near Dead Man's Bluff, a cliffside that plunges straight down into a deep gorge. The place got its name from an old legend about a hiker who went missing there years ago. They never found his body. People say he still roams the woods, lost, calling for help in the dead of night. I left the ranger station just before dusk, radio in hand, flashlight clipped to my belt. The hike out to the bluff was about an hour, mostly through dense forest. As the sun began to sink behind the trees, the temperature dropped and the shadows stretched longer, turning the forest into a maze of shifting darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering sound carried on the breeze. At first I thought it was just the wind moving through the pines, but the more I listened, the more distinct it became. It wasn't random. It was like voices. Multiple voices whispering in unison, too low for me to make out the words. I stopped, scanning the trees around me. Nothing, just the endless stretch of forest and the creeping darkness. But the whispering continued, just on the edge of my hearing, like it was coming from all directions at once. A chill ran down my spine and I picked up the pace, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. As I neared Dead Man's Bluff, the whispering faded, replaced by a different sound. The crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. They weren't mine. I froze, listening. The footsteps were coming from somewhere behind me, slow and deliberate. Someone, or something, was following me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No response. Just the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the wind. I turned, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight. I shined the beam into the trees, sweeping it back and forth. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the gnarled trunks of the pines and the thick underbrush. But the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. The silence was thick, heavy, like the entire forest was holding its breath along with me. And then, a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible voice. Close enough to make my blood run cold. "Help me." It was a whisper, barely audible, but it was there. Someone, or something, was out there, calling to me. But there was no one in sight, just the trees, looming like silent sentinels in the fading light. I should have turned back right then. I should have radioed for backup, reported the strange noises, and gone back to the safety of the ranger station. But I didn't. Some part of me, the part that had heard the stories about Dead Man's Bluff, needed to know what was out there. I continued on, my steps quicker now, my eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to shift with every movement. The bluff was just ahead, the edge of the cliff visible through a break in the trees. I approached cautiously, my pulse pounding in my ears. The moment I reached the cliff's edge, everything went still. The wind stopped, the whispering ceased, and the forest fell into an unnatural silence. The gorge below was a black void, impossible to see into with the growing darkness, but I didn't need to see it to feel the weight of something watching me. That's when I heard the voice again. "Help me." It was louder this time, clearer, as if the speaker was standing right next to me. My heart pounded, and I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly into the trees. And there, standing just at the edge of the light, was a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, and his eyes. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that stared straight through me. He stood motionless, lips barely moving as the same phrase repeated over and over. "Help me." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rocks at the cliff's edge. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. But before I could react, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided, unnaturally fast, closing the distance between us in an instant. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The whispering returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices surrounding me, suffocating me. Panic surged through me. I bolted, running blindly through the trees, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. The voices followed, growing louder, more insistent. "Help me! Help me!" I didn't stop until I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, panting, my chest tight with fear. I threw myself inside, locking the doors, and sat there, shaking, listening to the pounding of my heart. The voices had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I drove back to the station as fast as the narrow, winding road would allow. When I finally got there, I sat in the truck for a long time, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I reported the incident to my supervisor. He didn't say much, just nodded and told me to take a few days off if I needed them. But as I left his office, he gave me a look that told me he knew exactly what I'd encountered. I never went back to Dead Man's Bluff after that night. I couldn't. But sometimes when I'm out in the park, I still hear it. That soft, haunting whisper. "Help me." And I know, whatever is out there, it's still waiting, still watching. But I won't be going back. Not ever. We arrived at the campsite just before sunset, the last golden rays barely filtering through the towering pines. It was a remote spot, miles from any town or other campers, a perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. That's what we were looking for, after all. Just me, my girlfriend Anna, and our two close friends Mark and Jessica. The park ranger who issued our camping permits had warned us. He said these woods were different. "Stay on the trails. Don't wander too far after dark," he had said with a strange intensity, his eyes never quite meeting ours. At the time, I'd written it off as a standard scare tactic, the kind rangers used to keep campers from getting lost. But as I watched the sun dip below the horizon and the shadows stretch long across the forest floor, I felt the weight of his words settle on me. We set up camp quickly, the crackle of our fire breaking the oppressive silence of the woods. The sky turned from gold to purple, and finally, deep black. No stars tonight, just an endless, suffocating darkness. The first strange thing happened just after we'd finished dinner. Mark had gone to gather more firewood, leaving the rest of us around the fire. We heard a low rustling sound coming from the direction he had gone. At first we thought it was him, but the sound didn't match his footsteps. It was slower, more deliberate, like something was slithering through the underbrush. "Mark?" Anna called, her voice wavering slightly. No response. The rustling grew louder, closer, until suddenly Mark burst through the trees, pale and out of breath. He dropped the wood he was carrying and collapsed by the fire, eyes wide. "What the hell happened?" I asked, but he just shook his head, muttering something under his breath about seeing a deer. He wouldn't or couldn't elaborate. The mood around the campfire shifted after that. Jessica tried to lighten the atmosphere, telling some dumb ghost story about the woods, but none of us were listening. There was something in the air, thick and heavy, like the forest itself was watching us. The sounds of the woods had gone quiet. No wind, no animals, just a pressing silence that seemed to swallow our voices. After a while, we decided to call it a night. The fire was burning low, and the cold had begun to creep in. We retreated to our tents, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Sometime in the night, I woke up to the sound of movement just outside the tent. It was subtle at first, like twigs snapping, but then came that rustling again, louder this time, circling the camp. Anna stirred next to me, and I could tell from the way she stiffened that she'd heard it too. "What is that?" she whispered. I didn't answer, just grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent. The cold air hit me like a wall, but it wasn't the cold that made my skin crawl. It was the smell. A sickly, sweet stench, like rotting meat. I shone the light around, scanning the perimeter of our camp. Nothing. But the trees. Something was wrong with the trees. At first I couldn't figure it out, but then it hit me. They were too still, like they were frozen in place. Not a single leaf moving despite the chill in the air. Then from somewhere deep in the woods came a sound that made my blood turn to ice. A high-pitched wail, distant at first but rising in intensity, like something was in pain. It was human, or almost human. It sounded like someone calling for help, but distorted, stretched out, and wrong. "Did you hear that?" Anna asked, her voice shaking. I nodded, my heart racing. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the hatchet from our pack. I didn't know what I was planning to do with it, but it felt better than being unarmed. I stepped out of the tent, listening carefully. The wail came again, closer this time. Mark and Jessica must have heard it too, because I saw them emerge from their tent, eyes wide with fear. "I think someone's out there," Jessica whispered. "No," Mark said firmly, his face pale. "That's not a person. We need to stay here. We need to—" His voice cut off as something moved in the shadows beyond the trees, a dark silhouette just barely visible in the beam of my flashlight. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs seemed to bend in ways that didn't make sense. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. I could feel it in my bones. "What the hell is that?" Anna whispered, clutching my arm. The figure stepped closer, and as it did I could see its face, or what should have been its face. But there was nothing there, just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over a skull. No eyes, no mouth, just a featureless mask of flesh. It raised one long, spindly arm pointing toward us. The wailing sound came again, but this time it was louder, piercing, as if it were coming from inside my own head. I dropped the flashlight, backing away. "We need to run," Mark hissed. "Now." We turned and bolted for the trail, not caring where it led as long as it was away from that thing. The wailing followed us, growing fainter as we ran deeper into the woods, but it never disappeared entirely. It was always just at the edge of hearing, like a memory you couldn't shake. Eventually we stumbled upon an old ranger station, abandoned and half-collapsed, but it was shelter. We barricaded ourselves inside, gasping for breath, our minds racing. "What the hell was that?" Jessica panted, her eyes wild with fear. "I don't know," I said, glancing out the cracked window into the blackness beyond. "But I don't think it's gone." We sat in silence, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. That's when Mark spoke, his voice low and trembling. "I think I saw it earlier," he admitted. "When I went to get wood. I didn't want to believe it, but I think it's a skinwalker." The word hung in the air like a curse. I'd heard the legends, of course, stories of shape-shifting creatures that could mimic human voices, lure people into the woods, and steal their skin. I never believed them. Until now. Suddenly, the wailing started again, louder than before, and then came the voice. "Help me!" It was Anna's voice. But Anna was right next to me. Slowly we all turned to look at her. She was staring at the door, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Then in the dim light I saw it, the smallest twitch, a flicker of movement under her skin, like something was crawling just beneath the surface. The thing outside wasn't trying to get in. It already had. I always loved the woods. Growing up in a small town nestled against the edge of a vast forest, the wilderness had always felt like home to me. The trees, the wildlife, the peace, it all offered an escape from the stress of everyday life. So when I had a long weekend off work, I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep in the Pine Ridge Forest. I'd been there a few times before, but this trip was different. This time I wanted to go farther, off the beaten path, to a secluded part of the forest I'd heard about but never visited. It was supposed to be pristine, untouched. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the air crisp and cool as I set off into the wilderness with nothing but my pack and a sense of freedom. By midday, I'd hiked farther than I ever had before. The trails had long disappeared, leaving me to rely on my compass and the map I'd picked up from the ranger station earlier that morning. Speaking of rangers, I had a strange encounter at the station. The guy behind the desk looked at me for a long moment when I told him where I was headed. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was thinking something. "Just be careful out there," he finally said, almost too casually. "It's easy to get lost if you're not familiar with the terrain." I assured him I was prepared. I've camped alone plenty of times, but as I was leaving I thought I saw him glance out the window into the woods behind the station. He had that look, like he knew something I didn't. I shook it off. I wasn't superstitious and I wasn't easily spooked. The forest was beautiful, dense with tall pines that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. The deeper I went, the more the feeling of isolation set in. No cell service, no people, just the sound of the wind through the branches and the occasional rustling of wildlife in the underbrush. By evening I found the perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing beside a creek, the only sound being the trickle of water. As I pitched my tent, I couldn't help but feel that creeping sense that something was off. Not wrong exactly, just strange. The air felt thicker here, more still. The usual noise of the forest seemed distant, muffled. Night fell quickly. I sat by the fire eating a simple meal and enjoying the quiet. But it wasn't long before the silence grew unnerving. There was an edge to it, like the forest was holding its breath. No crickets, no distant owls, just nothing. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the crackle of the fire and the warmth it provided, but then I heard it, a faint sound like branches snapping, far off in the distance. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but then it happened again, closer and again, louder this time, like something was walking through the woods, slowly, methodically. I froze, listening, my eyes scanning the darkness just beyond the firelight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. No response, just the sound of more footsteps, closer now, circling. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I stood and grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the tree line. Nothing, just shadows. But I knew something was out there, watching. I sat back down by the fire, trying to shake the feeling, but it stayed with me. That primal, instinctive fear. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. Like the forest itself was awake, aware of me. I decided to turn in early, hoping the feeling would pass. I zipped myself into my tent, leaving the fire burning low outside. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something, soft rustling, distant snaps, and always that feeling of being watched. Hours passed. Then, in the dead of night, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing. Not my own. It was outside the tent, low and steady, like something massive was just feet away. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the flashlight, flicking it on. The beam shone through the thin fabric of the tent, casting long shadows. The breathing stopped. I held my breath, waiting, listening. After what felt like an eternity, I heard something moving away from the tent, back into the trees. Slow, deliberate steps. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there listening to the forest, trying to convince myself it was just an animal passing through. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Morning came, and with it a sense of relief. The daylight made everything seem less threatening. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of that breathing. I decided to cut my trip short. Something was wrong here. Something I couldn't explain. As I packed up my gear, I heard a voice behind me. Heading out early, I jumped, spinning around to see the park ranger from the station standing at the edge of the clearing. But something was off about him. His clothes were the same, but his face, his expression didn't quite match. It was as if he was trying too hard to appear friendly, his smile too wide, his eyes too unblinking. "Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Just thought I'd get an early start. He nodded slowly, but his gaze never left mine. Good idea. This part of the forest, it can be unpredictable. I glanced at his name tag, only it was missing, just a blank space where it should have been. My stomach turned as he took a step closer. His movement wasn't right. Too smooth, too unnatural. I felt the weight of his stare, and a cold realization crept over me. The ranger, if that's what he was, hadn't left any tracks. Not a single footprint in the soft dirt. I'd head back the way you came, he said, his voice low, almost a growl now. And don't look back. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my pack and started down the trail, moving quickly. I could feel him behind me, his eyes boring into my back, but I didn't dare turn around. As I neared the edge of the forest, I heard the footsteps again. Only this time they weren't behind me. They were all around me. In the trees, in the shadows, moving with me. I was being followed, hunted. By the time I reached the trailhead, my heart was in my throat. I practically ran to my car, tossing my gear inside and jumping behind the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The ranger stood at the edge of the trees watching, but his face wasn't human anymore. It was twisted, contorted, like something trying to wear human skin but failing. I hit the gas, my tires kicking up dirt as I sped away. I don't know what I encountered in that forest. Maybe it was a skinwalker or something worse. But whatever it was, it had been watching me from the moment I stepped off the trail, and it let me go. For now. The 5 of us thought it would be an unforgettable weekend, a much-needed break from work, stress, and the endless grind. Me, Nate, Emily, Chris, and Sophie had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We'd found an isolated spot deep in Green Ridge Forest, a place so remote it wasn't even on most maps. No cell service, no crowds, just miles of dense trees and untouched wilderness. Perfect, right? By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was already dipping behind the treetops, casting long shadows through the woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the only sounds the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt like we were the only people in the world. That first night, we settled in quickly, tents pitched, a fire roaring, and beers cracked open. Nate told his usual dumb jokes. Chris tried to scare us with a story about some local legend, which I ignored. And Sophie snapped pictures for her Instagram, trying to capture the perfect camping aesthetic. We were relaxed, happy. That was until we heard the scream. It was distant, faint enough that we weren't sure we heard it at all at first. But then it came again, unmistakable. A shrill, blood-curdling scream far off in the woods. We all froze, staring at each other in shock. What the hell was that? Sophie whispered, her face pale. Probably just some animal, Nate said, though his voice wavered. You know, like a mountain lion or something. They can sound like a woman screaming. Emily nodded, though she looked uneasy. Yeah, that's probably it. Animals. But something about the scream felt wrong. It wasn't just an animal call. It sounded too human, too desperate. Chris stood up, his expression grim. I think we should check it out. What if someone's hurt? Out here? I asked. There's no one for miles. Maybe a lost hiker, he insisted. We can't just ignore it. Against my better judgment, we grabbed our flashlights and headed into the woods, leaving the safety of the campfire behind. The further we walked, the quieter the night became. No more wind, no more animals, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on dead leaves. The scream didn't come again, but we pressed on deeper into the forest. The trees were thick, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, and every shadow seemed to move just out of sight. Do you see that? Emily asked suddenly, her voice shaking. We all stopped, peering into the darkness where she was pointing. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, just beyond the reach of the flashlight beam, something glinted. two small, reflective eyes low to the ground staring at us. My breath caught in my throat. An animal? I suggested, though I didn't believe it. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared. Chris took a step forward, shining his light toward the eyes. As the beam hit them, they vanished, gone, as if whatever had been watching us had melted into the darkness. "Let's go back," Sophie said, her voice tight with fear. "This doesn't feel right." I was about to agree when the scream came again, louder this time, closer. It echoed through the trees, sending a cold shiver down my spine. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and I realized we had wandered too far from camp. The fire was just a memory behind us, and all around, the woods felt wrong, like they were closing in. "We need to go," I said firmly, gripping my flashlight tighter. Chris opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, something moved in the darkness, fast, a blur of motion darting between the trees. We all turned our flashlights toward it, but whatever it was gone before the light could catch it. "Did you see that?" Nate hissed, his voice low. I nodded, my stomach twisting in knots. There was something out there, watching us, hunting us. Without another word, we turned and hurried back the way we came, trying to retrace our steps to camp. But the deeper we walked, the more I realized we were lost. The woods all looked the same in the dark, every tree a twin of the last, every path leading nowhere. "We should have marked the trail," Emily muttered, her voice cracking. "We should have—" She was cut off by another sound, a low, guttural growl, so close it made my blood turn to ice. We all froze, flashlights whipping around wildly, but there was nothing, just trees, just shadows. Then the eyes appeared again. This time, they weren't low to the ground. They were higher, at the level of a human's eyes. Dozens of them, surrounding us in a wide circle. Reflective, unblinking eyes watching from the darkness. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared like they were waiting for something. "We need to run," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But before we could move, the eyes shifted, darting closer, closing the circle around us. My breath hitched as I realized what we were dealing with. These weren't animals. They weren't human. One of the figures stepped forward into the light, its form barely recognizable, twisted, deformed. It looked like a man, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending the wrong way. Its face was hollow, the skin pulled too tight over its skull, its mouth hanging open in a twisted grin that exposed far too many teeth. The creature took another step forward, and then another until it was almost close enough to touch. I couldn't move. None of us could. It was like we were frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then the thing spoke. Its voice was low and raspy, like it hadn't used its vocal cords in years. "You don't belong here." And with that, the woods erupted into chaos. The creatures rushed us, moving faster than any human could. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as I fell to the ground. Around me, my friends were screaming, but it was all a blur. A nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was those eyes, those horrible, glowing eyes, and that twisted smile bearing down on me. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was filtering through the trees, casting everything in a warm, golden light. It almost felt like a dream, until I looked around and realized I was alone. The camp was gone. My friends were gone. No tents, no backpacks, nothing but me, lying in the dirt. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints, no blood, just nothing. But I knew what I had seen, what we had all seen. And now every time I close my eyes, I see them, those eyes in the woods, watching, waiting. I never found my friends, and I'll never go back to that forest. But sometimes at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the scream. I've always been a solo camper. There's something about the solitude of nature, far from the noise and chaos of civilization, that soothes me. So when I decided to take a trip deep into the remote reaches of Blackwood National Forest, I didn't think twice. I had my gear, a map, and an eagerness to disappear for a few days. It was the kind of place where cell service was non-existent, and the closest town was an hour's drive away, exactly what I wanted. I arrived at the trailhead late afternoon, the sun already casting long shadows through the towering pines. The forest here felt different, thicker. I chalked it up to the age of the woods, centuries-old trees standing sentinel, their trunks wide and gnarled. As I hiked deeper, I could feel a subtle shift in the air, like the forest itself was watching. But I ignored it. It's easy to spook yourself when you're alone. By dusk, I found a small clearing beside a creek and set up camp. The sound of the water was calming, and for a while, I just sat by the fire, listening to the wind rustle the leaves overhead. The peace was short-lived. I began to notice things, little things, that felt off. A few birds darted past my camp, squawking loudly, like they were fleeing something. I shrugged it off. Animals act strange sometimes. Then there were the sounds, distant, almost imperceptible at first. A snap of a twig, a rustle in the brush just outside the firelight. Probably a deer, I thought, or maybe a fox. But as the night deepened, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds of nightlife, crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of small creatures, were absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. My fire crackled, a sharp contrast to the stillness. That's when I heard it. Low, guttural breathing coming from the darkness. I stood, gripping my flashlight, and pointed it in the direction of the sound. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, telling myself it was an animal. But the breath, it sounded too close, too human. I sat back down, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept darting to the edges of the firelight, expecting something to lunge out from the blackness. Then a voice, raspy, barely audible, whispered from the darkness, "Help me!" My blood ran cold. I leapt to my feet again, shining the light in all directions. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I thought maybe someone was lost, maybe injured. But the voice, it didn't sound right. There was no emotion in it, no urgency, just a flat, hollow tone. I grabbed my pack and considered leaving right then, but I was miles deep into the woods, and hiking out in the dead of night didn't seem like the safest option. As I weighed my choices, I heard the voice again, closer this time. "Help me." Suddenly a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and a man in a ranger's uniform stepped into my camp. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a worn face that looked like it had seen too many winters out here. Relief washed over me. "Thank God," I said, my voice shaky. "I heard something. Someone. There's a person out there asking for help." The ranger's face didn't change. He just stared at me, his eyes hollow, as if he didn't fully understand what I was saying. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You need to leave. Now." "What? Why? What's going on?" He glanced around the dark woods, his expression unreadable. "You're not safe here." I didn't need to be told twice. I hastily packed up my things. All the while the ranger stood silently, watching. Something about his presence unnerved me, but I wasn't going to argue. As I slung my pack over my shoulder, I heard it again. "Help me." It was louder now, more insistent, and it was coming from the direction the ranger had come from. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight flickering as if it was struggling to stay on. "I need to—" "Don't." The ranger's voice was cold, firm. "It's not what you think." Before I could respond, the underbrush behind the ranger shifted. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. She was mouthing something, but no sound came out. I stepped back, heart pounding. Who is that?" The ranger turned slowly, and I saw something flicker in his expression. Fear. But it wasn't directed at the woman. No, it was like he was afraid of me seeing her. "Get out of here," he said through gritted teeth, but his voice wavered. I didn't move. Everything in me was screaming to run, but I was frozen in place, staring at the woman. Then, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and her body, her entire body, started to contort, limbs bending at unnatural angles, joints snapping loudly in the silence. Her skin began to ripple, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. The ranger stepped back, his face pale. "Run." I didn't wait. I turned and bolted into the woods, not caring which direction I was heading. The sounds of cracking bones and that awful distorted voice echoed behind me. "Help me!" Branches whipped at my face and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I could hear footsteps, heavy, fast, gaining on me. But they weren't human. The thud of paws, the snapping of underbrush, something was chasing me. I stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for breath, when I saw him again. The ranger, standing at the edge of the clearing, his face half lit by the moon. But something was wrong. His eyes, they weren't human anymore. Too dark, too reflective. And his mouth was too wide, stretched into a grin that split his face. Before I could scream, he spoke, his voice a guttural growl. "You should have left." Behind him, shadows shifted, large figures moving on all fours, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They circled me slowly, teeth bared, and I realized the awful truth. The ranger hadn't been trying to protect me. He had been leading me deeper into their territory. The last thing I saw before everything went black was his grin widening, revealing rows of jagged, inhuman teeth. I woke up the next morning lying in the same clearing. My gear was gone, and the forest was eerily calm, as if nothing had happened. But the deep claw marks on the trees and the heavy footprints in the dirt told a different story. When I finally made it back to civilization, no one believed me. They said Blackwood Forest had been closed for years, ever since the rangers disappeared. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help me." I've always been drawn to the solitude of the wilderness, the stillness, the quiet, no city noise, no distractions, just you and the world. That's why I volunteered for the solo camping trip deep in the national forest. I'd done these before, but this time felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the ranger's warning as I checked in at the station. He was older, grizzled, his eyes cold as he handed me the map. "Stick to the marked trails. If you hear anything at night, don't leave your tent. Don't try to follow it." It felt more like a threat than advice. I laughed it off, assuming he was just trying to spook me, some kind of initiation for the more remote trails. But his expression didn't change. "I'm serious," he said, gripping the edge of the map a little too tightly. "Things out there aren't always what they seem." I brushed it off. I wasn't one for campfire stories. Superstition had never really done much for me. But looking back, I should have listened. It took most of the day to reach my campsite, nestled in a remote area near a small mirror-like lake. Tall pines towered above, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers against the pale afternoon sky. There was something unnerving about the way the trees loomed overhead, the way their trunks seemed to stretch too far into the darkening woods. But I set up camp, boiled some water for dinner, and settled in. By dusk, everything felt normal, the usual chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But as the last light of the sun vanished behind the mountains, the forest fell unnaturally silent. No more crickets, no wind, nothing. Just dead, suffocating quiet. At first, I welcomed it. I've always found peace in the silence, but this wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself that isolation does weird things to the mind. But the stillness wasn't just in my head. I could feel it in my chest, a tightness that wouldn't go away. It was as if something was out there watching me. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, barely a whisper on the breeze, but unmistakable. A distant cry, almost human, but not quite. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, far beyond the lake, echoing through the trees. I froze, listening. There it was again, a little louder this time. The cry was drawn out, rising and falling like someone, or something, calling for help. I told myself it was probably an animal, a coyote or maybe even a mountain lion, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. There was something wrong about it, something unnatural in the way it seemed to carry on the air, too long, too distorted. My skin prickled. I stood by the edge of the lake, squinting into the darkness beyond the tree line. The moon cast a faint glow over the water, but the woods were a wall of shadows, impenetrable and still. The cry came again, closer now. For a moment I considered packing up and leaving, but then, as if on cue, the sound stopped. Just like that. The silence that followed was deeper than before, a void that swallowed everything else. No wind, no movement, just the overwhelming sense that I was not alone. I turned back toward my tent, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I wouldn't let some eerie sounds ruin my trip. I climbed into my sleeping bag and shut my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep. But the woods had other plans. Sometime in the middle of the night I woke up, my breath caught in my throat. Something was outside the tent. I could hear it. At first it was just a faint rustling, like footsteps, moving slowly around the perimeter. I held my breath, every muscle tensing. It didn't sound like an animal. The steps were deliberate, heavy. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper, someone lost in the woods. But no one else was supposed to be out here. I was miles from the nearest trail. And whoever or whatever it was wasn't calling out for help. They just kept circling. I lay still, my heart hammering in my chest, straining to hear through the fabric of the tent. Then it spoke. A voice, soft and low, barely more than a whisper, but I could hear it clearly through the thin canvas walls. Come out. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Come out, Derek. My blood turned to ice. It knew my name. How could it know my name? I forced myself to stay silent, though my mind was screaming. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. No one knew I was here. And that voice, it didn't sound quite human. There was something off, something jagged about it. The voice called again, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from outside the tent anymore. It was inside. I scrambled backward, slamming into the side of the tent as my heart leaped into my throat. But there was no one there. Nothing. The tent was empty. I could hear the voice again, faint, like it was coming from a distance now. Outside, in the woods. Come find me, Derek. I grabbed my flashlight, fumbling with the zipper of the tent, and I stumbled outside into the cold night air. The forest stretched out before me, quiet and endless, the trees swaying gently in the breeze that had returned without warning. I scanned the woods with my light, heart pounding in my ears. Nothing, just trees and shadows, and then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the lake, its back to me, was a figure. Tall, thin, unnaturally still. Its head was tilted slightly to one side, as if it were listening to something I couldn't hear. My flashlight flickered as I raised it, the beam barely cutting through the fog that had settled over the water. The figure turned slowly, unnaturally, like it wasn't used to moving its own limbs. And then I saw its face. It wasn't a person, not really. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, and its eyes, black, empty holes, bored into me. Its mouth twisted into a smile, too wide, too forced. Come find me, it whispered again, though the sound wasn't coming from its mouth. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned and ran, branches whipping at my face and arms as I crashed through the woods, heart hammering. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I don't know how long I ran. Maybe hours, maybe minutes. But when I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I found myself back at the lake. My campsite was gone, My tent, my gear, everything. The clearing where I'd set up camp was empty, as if I had never been there, and standing at the edge of the lake, watching me with those empty black eyes, was the figure. It didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. I already knew. The forest had claimed me, and I would never leave. Hollow Creek wasn't on any official map. It was one of those forgotten places locals only talked about in passing, and only then with a strange, hushed tone, as if mentioning it too loudly would invite something unwelcome. It was precisely the kind of place my friends and I were looking for. Remote, untouched, the perfect spot for a weekend of camping. We wanted to get away from it all. The noise of the city, our jobs, everything. Nothing but nature and us, Tony had said with a grin, packing up the last of his gear. I had smiled, ignoring the twinge of unease I felt as we prepared to head out. I'd heard the stories, just like everyone else. Stories about people who went into Hollow Creek and never came back. Stories about the trees whispering your name, about shadows that moved where no person should be. But those were just stories, right? The four of us, me, Tony, Sarah, and Lucas, set out early Saturday morning. The drive was long, and the roads became rougher as we left the small town behind. The further we went, the more it felt like we were entering another world. The trees here were ancient, towering above us with branches that twisted and tangled in ways that made the light from the sky seem dimmer. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. By the time we arrived at Hollow Creek, the sun was beginning to set. The creek itself was narrow, winding through the forest like a black ribbon, its waters still and strangely reflective. We set up camp by its banks, the sound of the water barely a trickle as it moved over the rocks. There were no birds singing, no rustling of animals, just silence. At first it felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. We got a fire going, and for a while it felt like any other camping trip. We joked, passed around beers, and talked about nothing in particular. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The firelight seemed dimmer than it should have been, the shadows creeping closer with every passing minute. It was Sarah who noticed the first strange thing. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice low. We all stopped talking, listening. At first I didn't hear anything, just the crackling of the fire and the soft gurgle of the creek. Then faintly I heard it, a soft murmur like voices. But they weren't coming from us. They were coming from the trees. "Probably just the wind," Tony said, though his voice lacked the usual bravado. We all agreed, though none of us seemed convinced. As the night dragged on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was like they were trying to say something, but the words were garbled, distant, just out of reach. Every time I turned my head toward the sound, it stopped, only to start again when I wasn't looking. Lucas was the first to snap. "This is freaking weird, man," he said, standing up and pacing around the campfire. "I'm not hearing things right. You all hear it too?" We did, and that was the problem. By midnight, none of us could deny it anymore. The forest was alive with voices, low, echoing whispers that seemed to rise from the ground itself like the earth was speaking to us. Every now and then, I thought I heard my name in the mix, soft, insistent. "Matt." At first I thought I was imagining it, but when I looked at the others, I could tell they were hearing their names too. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide, as she stared into the fire, and Tony, who was always the tough guy, was gripping the edge of his chair, his knuckles white. "We should leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We shouldn't be here." But where would we go? The darkness pressed in on all sides, the forest endless and impenetrable. And those whispers, they never stopped. They seemed to come from every direction at once, growing louder with every passing second. Then the trees began to move. I don't mean the wind rustling through the branches. No, these trees shifted. It was subtle at first, a branch here, a trunk bending slightly there. But soon, the whole forest seemed to be swaying, the trees leaning in toward our camp like they were alive, like they were watching us. And then I saw something in the distance, just beyond the edge of the firelight, between the thick pines. A figure stood, tall, too tall to be human, its body thin and impossibly long. Its face, if it had one, was hidden by the shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly, like two dull embers in the dark. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my throat dry, my voice barely audible. No one answered, but I knew they saw it too. The figure didn't move. It just watched us, silent, patient, waiting. Then, slowly, it stepped forward. The fire sputtered as a gust of wind swept through the clearing, the flames nearly going out. The figure disappeared into the darkness for a moment, only to reappear closer, the shadows shifting around it unnaturally. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "We have to go," I said, standing up, grabbing Sarah's arm. But before we could do anything, the whispers rose to a deafening roar, swirling around us, suffocating us with their intensity. They weren't whispers anymore. They were screams. They were all around us, screaming our names, screaming words I couldn't understand, the voices overlapping, growing louder and louder. The trees swayed violently, their branches clawing at the sky like they were trying to tear it open. And that figure, it was closer now, just at the edge of the firelight, towering over us. I could see its face now, elongated, hollow, with no eyes, no features, just a void where its face should have been. Tony grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it wildly in the air, yelling for the figure to stay back. But it didn't flinch. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. And behind it, I saw more of them. Dozens of figures, tall and thin, their bodies barely visible in the shifting shadows. We bolted it. I don't know how we made it out of the clearing, but we ran like our lives depended on it. The trees whipped past us, their branches reaching out like hands, trying to pull us back. The whispers followed, screaming louder than ever, our names echoing through the forest. Matt, Sarah, Tony. We didn't stop running until we burst out onto the dirt road, our lungs burning, our hearts racing. The forest was behind us now, but the whispers, they were still there, just on the edge of hearing, carried on the wind. When we finally made it back to the car, none of us spoke. We drove in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us like a lead blanket. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine and, in the distance, the faint echo of the whispers that had followed us out of the woods. We haven't talked about it since. I don't know what's in Hollow Creek and I don't ever want to find out, but sometimes late at night I still hear it, my name whispered on the wind. It calls to me, beckoning as if the forest is waiting for me to come back. And I know deep down that if I do, I won't make it out again. We were looking for something different, something to shake off the monotony of our lives back in the city. A remote camping trip, far from technology, far from the humdrum of urban life, seemed like the perfect idea. So, I joined Alex, Mia, and Logan for a weekend deep in the Ironwood National Forest. It wasn't a popular spot. In fact, most people I talked to didn't even know it existed. I should have taken that as a warning. We arrived at Ironwood late in the afternoon. The road was nothing more than a narrow dirt path barely visible through the thick brush. No signs, no markers, just endless trees. The deeper we drove, the more the forest seemed to close in on us. Still, we were excited. The isolation was what we wanted. No distractions, no people. Just us and nature. The trail ended in a large circular clearing surrounded by towering pines that cast long shadows over the campsite. It looked unnatural, almost like someone had carved the space out of the forest on purpose. But we didn't dwell on it. Instead, we unloaded the car, set up our tents, and got a fire going as dusk settled in. The first strange thing happened almost immediately. Logan, always the jokester, had been tossing sticks into the fire, trying to see how many he could land on top of the burning logs. Then, out of nowhere, he stopped. He was standing near the edge of the clearing, just staring out into the trees. "What's up?" Mia asked, noticing his sudden silence. He didn't answer at first. He just stood there motionless, peering into the woods. I walked over to him, nudging his shoulder. "Logan?" I thought I saw someone," he muttered, shaking his head like he was trying to snap out of a daze. I followed his gaze into the forest. Nothing, just trees and the growing darkness. "There's no one out here but us," I said, trying to laugh it off. "Maybe you've been working too hard. You're seeing things." Logan chuckled weakly, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "Yeah, probably just my imagination." We all settled back around the fire, talking and joking, trying to push away the odd feeling that hung over the clearing. But as the night deepened, the sense of isolation grew heavier, oppressive. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the tents, and the forest beyond was impossibly dark. That's when we heard it. A soft rustling like footsteps coming from the tree line. It was slow, deliberate, too rhythmic to be an animal. We all went silent, exchanging uneasy glances. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice tight. Alex, who had been poking at the fire with a stick, nodded slowly. "Yeah." Logan stood up, scanning the edge of the clearing with narrowed eyes. "Maybe it's another camper?" "In the middle of nowhere?" I replied. "We're miles from the nearest trail. Who the hell would be out here?" As if to answer my question, the rustling grew louder, closer. It circled us just beyond the firelight, moving through the trees in a wide arc around the clearing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. "Whatever it is, it's messing with us," Logan muttered, grabbing a flashlight. "I'm going to check it out." Before anyone could stop him, he strode toward the tree line, shining the light into the trees. The rest of us stood up, instinctively moving closer to the fire. The warmth suddenly felt like the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. "See anything?" Alex called out, his voice tense. Logan didn't answer. He was standing still again, just like before, the flashlight beam sweeping through the trees, catching nothing but branches and shadows. Then he started walking forward, disappearing into the woods. "Logan, wait!" Mia shouted, but he was already gone, swallowed by the forest. I grabbed my own flashlight and hurried after him, the others following close behind. The moment we stepped past the tree line, the clearing seemed to vanish. The trees were thick, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out the moonlight. The air felt colder, heavier. "Logan!" I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the silence. Nothing. Just the rustling of leaves, and then, faintly, the sound of footsteps ahead. We followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel the others' growing panic. After a few minutes, we found him. Logan was standing in the middle of a narrow trail, his back to us, staring at something ahead. "What the hell, man?" Alex said, grabbing Logan's shoulder. "You can't just wander off like that." Logan didn't move, didn't even flinch. "Logan?" I stepped in front of him, shining my flashlight in his face. His eyes were wide, unfocused, like he wasn't even seeing us. I followed his gaze, turning my flashlight toward the path ahead. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A figure standing between the trees, tall and thin. Too thin. Its limbs were long, almost unnaturally so, its skin pale and stretched tight across its bones. But it wasn't the figure itself that sent ice down my spine, it was its eyes. They were huge, black and reflective, like mirrors, catching the light from my flashlight and throwing it back at me. It was just standing there watching us. "Logan, come on," I whispered, grabbing his arm and tugging him back. He blinked, snapping out of his trance, and stumbled backward, his face pale. What is that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head slightly tilted, those reflective eyes locked on us. "We need to go," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." None of us argued. We turned and hurried back down the trail. Logan still dazed. Mia and Alex casting nervous glances over their shoulders every few seconds. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground. too afraid to look back. We stumbled into the clearing, breathless, and collapsed by the fire. The oppressive feeling of being watched was still there, heavier than before. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see those black, mirror-like eyes staring back at us. "Did you see it?" Logan finally whispered, his voice shaky. "That thing?" We all nodded, none of us willing to put it into words. We just sat there, huddled close to the fire, staring into the flames, too terrified to even consider going to sleep. The rustling started again. This time it was louder, more insistent, like something was circling us faster, closer. We all stood up, flashlights flickering toward the sound, but we couldn't see anything, just the trees, the shadows, and the darkness beyond. Then the whispers began. They were soft, almost unintelligible, coming from every direction at once, faint voices murmuring just at the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew, deep down, that they weren't human. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely steady. "Now." We didn't pack up, we didn't care. We grabbed what we could, our bags, our lights, and we ran. Through the trees, stumbling over roots and rocks, not daring to look back. The whispers followed us, growing louder with every step, and in the corner of my eye, I kept seeing them, those tall, thin figures, standing just beyond the edge of the light, their black eyes reflecting the moonlight. We made it back to the car just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. We didn't speak, didn't stop to breathe until we were miles away from Ironwood, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. None of us ever talked about what happened that night. We pretended it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. And I know they're still out there, in that clearing, watching, waiting. I can still hear the whispers. There's a stretch of forest up in the North Cascades known as the Widow's Hollow. Most people won't talk about it, but if you ask the old-timers in town, they'll tell you to stay away. I didn't listen. I'd been a park ranger for 5 years, and I'd heard all sorts of tall tales, ghost stories, cryptid sightings, the works. Widow's Hollow was no different. Supposedly, the place had been cursed for over a century. The story went that a woman lived there alone, deep in the woods. Her husband had gone off to war and never came back. She waited for him every day at the edge of the forest until one night she vanished. Some say she went mad with grief. Others claim she made a deal with something dark in the woods. Either way, no one ever saw her again. Only her cries, they say, echo through the trees on nights when the fog rolls in thick. I wasn't superstitious. I figured it was just another ghost story to keep kids from wandering too far. So when my boss assigned me to patrol the area around Widow's Hollow for a weekend, I shrugged it off. They needed someone to check the trails, make sure no campers had wandered into the area. That was my job. No big deal. I packed light, a tent, some food, the usual gear, and set off early on Friday. The trail was overgrown, the trees dense and suffocating, but I pushed through, keeping an eye on the fading trail markers. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet either. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. By the time I reached a small clearing, it was getting dark. I decided to set up camp there, figuring I'd finish the patrol the next day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to shift. The silence deepened, the air heavy and damp. A thick fog began to creep in from the trees, rolling slowly over the ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I sat by the fire, poking at the flames, trying to ignore the creeping unease. The light from the fire flickered and danced, casting strange shadows that seemed to move just a little too much for comfort. I could have sworn I saw shapes in the fog, but every time I blinked, they were gone. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint cry, soft at first, almost like the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing through the trees. It sounded like a woman, crying out in pain or sorrow. My stomach twisted. It had to be an animal, I told myself. Some weird bird call or a fox. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, scanning the tree line. The fog had thickened, swallowing the forest in a gray haze. The crying stopped, replaced by something worse. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush just beyond the light of the fire. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the fog. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and shaky. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the crackle of the fire and the oppressive weight of the fog pressing in around me. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it, I saw something. At the edge of the clearing, half obscured by the fog, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its eyes, two faint glowing orbs staring straight at me. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the firewood. I don't know what I expected, maybe for it to charge or vanish, but it didn't. It just stood there, watching me, its head tilting slowly to one side, almost curiously. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. The figure didn't move, but the fog did. It swirled and coiled around the figure's legs, crawling forward as though alive. And then, the crying started again, louder this time, closer, echoing from all around me. It wasn't just one voice now. It was several, overlapping, wailing in unison. The sound was unbearable, like nails scraping against my brain. I spun around, desperate to keep the figure in my sight, but it was gone. The clearing was empty. Only the fog remained, creeping closer. The cries rose into a fevered pitch, and I swore I could hear words, garbled and distorted, whispering in the fog. I bolted for my tent, grabbing my radio, trying to get a signal. Nothing, just static. The cries stopped again as suddenly as they had started, leaving only the heavy, suffocating silence. But this time, the footsteps returned. They circled my camp, slow and methodical. Closer, closer. I clutched my knife, my back pressed against the cold earth of the tent, my heart racing. Then a voice, clearer this time, soft and pleading. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, low and broken, like it had been worn ragged from years of crying. I peeked out from the tent flap, my flashlight shaking in my hand. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a woman. Her clothes were tattered, her skin pale, almost translucent in the moonlight. Her eyes were wide, sunken, filled with something that chilled me to my core, desperation, or maybe hunger. "Please, help me," she whispered again, taking a step forward. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Something was wrong. The way she moved, jerky, unnatural, like she was being pulled by strings. And her feet, they didn't touch the ground. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. She took another step closer, her eyes locked on mine, her mouth stretching into a too-wide grin. "Help me," she repeated, but the voice wasn't hers anymore. It was deeper, almost guttural, as if something else was speaking through her. I snapped. I grabbed my gear and ran, not caring which direction I was going. I just needed to get away. The fog seemed to part for me, as though guiding me deeper into the forest. The cries followed me, louder now, screaming in the wind. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually the trees thinned, and I stumbled onto an old dirt road. I collapsed, gasping for breath, the fog dissipating behind me. When I made it back to the ranger station, I told my boss what had happened. He didn't say much, just nodded grimly and told me to take the rest of the weekend off. But I saw the look in his eyes. He knew. Later I found out that Widow's Hollow hadn't been patrolled for years, not because it wasn't on the schedule, but because no one wanted to go there. The last ranger who did disappeared without a trace. All they found was his gear scattered in the clearing. I quit the job a week later, But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear the cries, faint, far off, like a woman lost in the woods begging for help. And I wonder, if I hadn't run, would I have become one of them too? Camping has always been my escape. The smell of pine, the crackle of a fire, the kind of silence that only the deep woods can offer. It's where I go to clear my head. This trip was supposed to be no different. Just me, a weekend alone in the wilderness, away from work, from stress, from everything. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. I never imagined it would end like this. I drove out to Redington Forest, a stretch of dense woods about 4 hours from the nearest town. The place was perfect, remote, untouched, with no hiking trails or campsites to attract crowds. In other words, exactly what I wanted, total solitude. I'd been there once before, but only for a day trip. This time, I planned on staying 2 nights, long enough to disconnect, but short enough to not worry anyone if I went off the grid for a while. I should have told someone where I was going. It started off perfectly. The weather was cool, the air crisp with the scent of pine needles and moss. I set up camp near a small clearing, just a stone's throw from a creek that bubbled quietly over rocks. The first day was peaceful, exactly what I needed. I spent it exploring the area, wandering through the trees, taking in the quiet. By dusk, I was sitting by my fire, watching the sky fade from deep blue to black, stars spilling out one by one. That night, I woke up to the sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was just a branch hitting my tent. The wind had picked up, and trees can make all kinds of noises in the night. I rolled over, trying to ignore it, but the tapping was persistent, rhythmic. It wasn't random like a branch would be. It was steady, intentional, like someone or something was drumming its fingers against the fabric of the tent. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, the kind that presses in on you, heavy and suffocating. Then it started again. Tap, tap, tap. My mind raced. There was no one else out here, I'd made sure of that. I didn't hear footsteps, no rustling in the underbrush, just that eerie, methodical tapping. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, heart hammering in my chest. I shone the light into the clearing. Nothing, just the fire, now reduced to glowing embers and the dark shapes of trees all around. I swept the beam across the ground, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the light. But there was nothing, just stillness. I let out a breath and backed into the tent, zipping it up tightly behind me. Maybe it was a loose branch after all, or some animal curious about the tent. That's what I told myself as I lay back down, staring at the thin fabric between me and the night. I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the tapping from the night before felt like a weird dream. I shook it off and decided to hike deeper into the forest. I figured a good day's hike would tire me out enough that I wouldn't be kept awake by any strange noises. I spent hours walking, exploring the dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. The deeper I went, the more ancient the forest felt. Trees towered over me, their gnarled roots twisting out of the earth like claws. The air smelled damp, rich with the scent of decaying leaves and wet soil. It felt different, like I had crossed some invisible boundary. That's when I saw it, or rather them. Carvings deep into the bark of several trees were symbols, strange, jagged symbols that I didn't recognize. They looked old, weathered, as if they had been there for years, but at the same time, there was something about them that felt recent, fresh almost. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings and my skin prickled. A deep unease settled over me. I've hiked in a lot of forests, but I've never seen anything like this. They weren't the usual initials or heart-shaped carvings couples leave behind. These symbols felt wrong, deliberate but without any obvious meaning. I decided it was time to head back to camp. The further I walked, the heavier the air seemed to get. The trees loomed taller, and the light filtering through the canopy grew dimmer, casting long, creeping shadows across the forest floor. The sense of being watched crept over me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. By the time I made it back to camp, it was late afternoon. I quickly gathered more wood for the fire, hoping the flames would chase away the unease that had clung to me all day. But that night, it got worse. I woke up again, but this time it wasn't tapping. It was whispering, faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Voices, low, hushed voices, like a conversation being carried out just beyond the thin walls of my tent. I froze, every muscle tense, straining to hear. The words were garbled, impossible to make out, but the tone was unmistakable, whispered, almost urgent, as if whoever or whatever was speaking didn't want to be overheard. I slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peek out, holding my breath. My flashlight was in my other hand, but I didn't turn it on yet. The campfire was nearly dead, casting a weak, flickering light around the clearing. And then I saw them, figures, tall, impossibly tall, standing just beyond the firelight. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. Their forms were thin, too thin to be human, their limbs long and spindly like the branches of the trees. I couldn't make out their faces, if they even had faces, just dark, elongated silhouettes. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. My mind raced, screaming at me to do something, anything. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the sight of them. Then one of them moved. It stepped forward just enough that the weak firelight caught the edge of its figure. Its limbs moved in slow, unnatural jerks, like it wasn't quite sure how to walk. And then it tilted its head, its body twisting at an impossible angle, as if studying me, as if deciding whether or not I was worth approaching. That was all it took. I scrambled out of the tent, adrenaline surging through me as I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care that it was the middle of the night, or that I didn't know my way out of the forest in the dark. I just ran. Behind me, I could hear the whispers growing louder, more frantic, like they were calling after me. The footsteps, heavy, thudding footsteps, followed me through the trees, but I didn't dare look back. The air was thick, oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides as I tore through the forest. I don't know how long I ran, but somehow by some miracle I found the dirt road that led back to the parking area. My car was still there, untouched, like a lifeline waiting for me. I didn't even stop to catch my breath as I jumped in and sped down the narrow road, my hands shaking on the wheel. I haven't been back to those woods since. I don't plan to. But sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it, that low, rhythmic tapping. And when I close my eyes, I see those tall, twisted figures standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching, waiting. The woods always had a way of swallowing sound, turning even the loudest footsteps into muffled whispers beneath the canopy. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me, my tent, and the isolation I'd been craving. The campsite I chose wasn't on any map, a small hidden clearing miles from any trailhead, the perfect place to disconnect from the world. I arrived at Black Pine Forest early that morning, the ranger at the station giving me the usual warnings about staying on marked paths and watching out for wildlife. His expression was more serious than I expected. He wasn't the chatty, friendly type you see in movies. This guy had a haunted look in his eyes, but I brushed it off. I didn't need to be coddled. I wanted to be alone. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and spent the afternoon hiking. By the time the sun began to set, I was back at camp, starting a small fire. As the darkness deepened, the familiar sounds of the forest started to quiet. Birds heading to roost, the rustle of leaves slowing with the breeze. But something about the quiet this time felt off. The silence felt heavy, like the woods were waiting. Around midnight, I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard it. A low, shuffling sound, barely louder than the crackling of the fire. I froze, listening closely. It sounded like someone dragging their feet through the leaves. I stood, grabbing my flashlight and sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing, just the trees and the stillness of the night. Probably a deer, I muttered, trying to convince myself, though I knew deep down that wasn't right. I'd seen deer before, and they didn't move like that. The shuffling continued, moving closer. I stepped toward the edge of the clearing, the hairs on my arms prickling with unease. My beam landed on something just beyond the tree line, something large but hunched, its shape obscured by the thick underbrush. My breath hitched in my throat as the figure rose slowly, standing upright, its body unnaturally tall and thin. I could barely make out its features, but I could feel it staring at me, even from a distance. "Hey," I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Who's there?" It didn't respond. Instead, it took a step forward, the shuffling sound growing louder. Then, with a sickening crack, its head jerked to the side, too fast, too sharp, like it was trying to look at me from an impossible angle. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the fire pit, but kept my flashlight trained on the figure. It was still, except for that twisted head. Then, slowly, it raised an arm, long and bony, pointing straight at me. My blood ran cold. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. Suddenly it spoke, its voice low and rasping like it hadn't been used in years. "Help me." The words sounded human, but distorted, like they were being forced through broken vocal cords. My stomach twisted as I realized the voice didn't match its figure at all. I backed up further, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I can't help you," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. It took another step forward, its limbs jerking unnaturally, and repeated, "Help me." I turned and bolted, leaving the fire, the tent, everything behind. My only thought was to get away from that thing, whatever it was. My heart pounded in my chest as I crashed through the underbrush, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. Behind me, I could hear the shuffling, the unmistakable sound of it following. The forest was a maze, the trees blurring together in the dark, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The sound of its pursuit grew louder, closer, its footsteps no longer dragging but pounding against the earth with unnatural speed. I could barely breathe, panic clawing at my throat. I tripped over a root, hitting the ground hard, but forced myself to get up, gasping for air. The footsteps stopped. I froze, listening, afraid to move. The silence was suffocating. I couldn't hear the thing anymore, but I could feel it, like its eyes were still on me, watching from the shadows. I slowly turned my head, scanning the trees with my flashlight. Nothing. The woods seemed empty, as if the thing had disappeared. Relief flooded through me for a brief moment, but then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, something creeping low to the ground, moving toward me. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't walking anymore. It was crawling, its limbs contorting, its long, spindly fingers digging into the earth. Before I could react, it was right in front of me, inches away. The flashlight flickered, and for the first time, I saw its face. It was wrong. Its skin looked too tight, stretched over a skull that was all angles and sharp edges. Its mouth hung open in a permanent, gaping grin, teeth too large for its face. But the worst part was its eyes, pitch black, hollow, and endless. It lunged at me, but before I could scream, a deafening gunshot rang out, lighting up the night. The thing recoiled, hissing, its body twitching violently before it skittered back into the darkness. I gasped, my chest heaving, and turned to see the ranger from the station standing a few feet away, rifle in hand. His face was pale, but he didn't look surprised. Just tired. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gruff. I nodded, still too stunned to speak. The ranger glanced toward the trees, his eyes hard. "You're lucky I found you," he muttered. "That thing's been stalking these woods for years." I finally found my voice. "Well, what was it?" He shook his head. "Don't know. People say it's a skinwalker, but I don't believe in that crap." His jaw tightened. "Whatever it is, it's not human anymore." The ranger gestured for me to follow him, and I didn't hesitate. As we walked back to the station, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the thing lurking in the shadows again. You should have stayed on the marked trails, the ranger said after a long silence. I nodded, guilt gnawing at me. I didn't think. Doesn't matter, he cut me off. What matters is you're still breathing. Not everyone's that lucky. We reached the station just before dawn, the sky turning a pale shade of gray. The ranger handed me a cup of coffee, his eyes never leaving the tree line. As I sipped the bitter liquid, I finally asked the question that had been gnawing at me. How did you know where I was? The ranger didn't answer right away. He stared out into the forest for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he turned to me, his eyes dark and hollow. I've been following you since you arrived. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My blood ran cold as I realized what he was saying. I glanced down at the rifle in his hand, then back at his face, his too smooth, too tight skin. A slow, twisted grin spread across his lips. After all, someone's got to make sure you make it back, right?